Welcome to the world of darkness where nightmares inhabit your dreams. I've noticed YouTube's algorithm hides my stories. Your interaction is the only way to reach new listeners. If these stories frighten you, please like, subscribe, and activate notifications. Any comment, however brief, helps spread my stories to other horror fans. Now relax, close your eyes, and let the rain wash away your thoughts as I guide you through tonight's terrifying tale. I've always enjoyed winter camping, the kinds of trips that really push you to your limits and force you to embrace the cold and silence of the frozen wilderness. A few years ago, I decided to go on a solo trip deep into north-central Pennsylvania. The area I picked out was so remote that getting there would require an hour-long drive down dirt Forest Service roads, followed by a 6-mile hike along a barely visible trail. There wasn't a soul around, and I wasn't expecting to see anyone. The quiet, snow-covered forest was exactly what I was looking for. The trail was rough, overgrown in places, and barely recognizable as a path. I had to push through dense, wet brush, and there were no footprints in the snow, no sign of anyone having been there recently. It felt like the kind of place that only those looking to truly escape the world would find. The trail followed a creek down a rocky valley, which didn't make for an easy hike, let me assure you. The terrain was steep and uneven, with ice patches and thick snow covering the rocks, making each step a careful decision. But the beauty of the place, the stillness, the quiet, crisp air, it was well worth the effort. I had no specific destination in mind. I was just wandering through the woods, hoping to find a good spot to set up camp. As the sun began to set and the temperature drastically dropped, I came to a fork in the creek. There was a section of relatively flat land that looked perfect for a campsite, and I carefully crossed the creek, stepping cautiously on the slippery rocks. Then I started to investigate the area. Scattered across the snow were signs that someone had been there recently. A tarp was spread out on the ground next to a stone fire ring, and nearby a log about a foot in diameter had been chopped in half so cleanly that it had to be with some kind of axe or blade. I moved closer, my curiosity piqued, but also a growing sense of unease settling in my gut. Inspecting the area more carefully, a pile of gear immediately stood out. There were food wrappers, a small cooking set, a camping pad, and a first aid kit. Everything someone might need for a winter camping trip. All of it was just left behind, carelessly discarded as if someone had just walked away from it mid-trip with no intention of coming back. I continued exploring, more irritated at this person's carelessness than anything, until I found the clothes. They were piled by the creek, damp from the last rainstorm that had passed through the day before. They weren't wet enough to be fresh, but they hadn't dried out properly either. They sat there, almost as if abandoned, with a towel draped over a nearby branch, still damp and heavy with moisture. It was an eerie sight, these everyday objects just left behind with no owner in sight. A shiver ran through me that had nothing to do with the frigid air. Then, as I walked a bit further, I came across something that truly disturbed me to my core. There was an area near the creek, clearly used as a toilet based on the disgusting mess left behind. Piles of toilet paper, some stained with feces and others with remnants of urine, were scattered across the ground. It wasn't just one or two pieces either. It was a whole mess of them, indicating that someone had been using the spot regularly for maybe 2 to 3 weeks. The stench hung in the air, only partially masked by the crisp scent of snow and pine. But that wasn't what I found so blood-chillingly disturbing, though. Hidden behind a cluster of trees was a strange metal structure, almost like a cage, but not anything I could make sense of at first glance. It was about 4 square feet, constructed from thick metal bars that looked like they'd been welded together to form a crude cube frame. Obviously, I knew it looked enough like a cage to call it one, but the thing that didn't make sense is that it didn't seem to have any kind of opening. No door, no hatch, no way for anything to get in or out once the final bar was welded into place. It looked like someone had purposely built that thing out there in the middle of nowhere, because no one in their right mind would have dragged that heavy monstrosity all the way out here. And it would also explain why they stayed in that one spot for so long based on the waste left behind. But then, why build it? And why construct it so that it was completely sealed with no way in or out? I felt a chill go through me, one that had nothing to do with the winter air. Something about the entire setup, everything from the abandoned gear to the weird cage, was enough to majorly give me the creeps. There was one major problem, though. With daylight dwindling, I'd been looking for a spot to camp. Now, with the sun starting to set, I could either turn back and try to hike out in the dark on a trail that I barely knew, or I could stay there, almost right next to the place that was giving me the worst feeling of dread I'd ever experienced. It wasn't an easy choice, but in the end I decided not to gamble on finding a new spot this late, and I set up camp right there, as far from the cage as I could get while still having access to the flat ground. I didn't feel safe at all, but the alternative of risking injury or getting lost in the dark posed risks that I wasn't prepared to entertain. Yet even though I was somewhat confident the cage builder wasn't going to return, there was a lot of trash but no tent or sleeping gear. I still felt incredibly on edge. I was constantly looking over my shoulder as I set up my small tent and built a fire, jumping at every noise in the darkening woods. The knife I carried was almost constantly in my hand, ready in case anything went wrong, but I still couldn't feel 100% safe, especially not after the sun went down fully and true darkness descended, broken only by the flickering orange glow of my small fire. Every rustling noise, every snap of a branch in the distance made my heart race, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. It felt like someone, or something, was watching me from the inky shadows just beyond the reach of my firelight. As I sat there, practically vibrating out of my skin with terror, my mind raced with all the horrific possibilities of what that cage could be for. Was it some kind of trap? A sadistic hunter's way of capturing animals to torture? Or perhaps something even more sinister, like a place to hold human captives? Each possibility I imagined was worse than the last, and I cursed myself for not hiking out immediately upon finding it. Darkness be damned. I barely ate, fear and nausea twisting my stomach into knots as I forced down a protein bar and some water. The night dragged on, minutes feeling like hours as I strained my ears for any noise that could signal approaching danger. I couldn't bring myself to crawl into my tent, feeling far too vulnerable with just the thin nylon walls between me and whatever was out there. So I stayed by the fire, clutching my knife and barely blinking, determined to face head-on anything that came my way. I barely slept at all that night, just brief snatches of fitful dozing propped up against a tree. I kept hearing things, sounds that had me wide awake and brandishing my knife in seconds. There were footsteps in the distance, the crunch of boots on snow, or at least that's what my petrified mind interpreted the noise as, and the sound of something big moving through the trees, branches cracking and bushes rustling, something far too large to be any kind of prey animal. The noises always seemed to be just beyond the edge of the fire's glow, too far away to make out clearly, but close enough to send shivers of pure terror down my spine. The fire flickered and crackled, casting long, black shadows that danced and writhed around me, shapes that looked almost human before morphing into monstrous forms. The play of light and shadow did little to calm my already shattered nerves, instead amping up the gut-wrenching horror of my predicament. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the trees, pale and thin in the winter air, I was already packing up as quickly as I could with trembling hands. I didn't care that I was still half asleep, that my body ached from tension and lack of rest. I wanted out of that place, away from that ungodly cage and the creeping certainty that something terrible had happened there, was maybe still happening. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the icy fingers of dread were wrapped around my throat as I shoved gear haphazardly into my pack with fumbling fingers. I left that awful valley behind without a second glance, not even bothering to fully extinguish the remains of my fire, before practically running back up the trail, following my footprints from the day before. The snow seemed even deeper as I slogged through it on sore, unstable legs. The straps of my pack dug into my shoulders. My lungs burned from gulping in frigid air, but I didn't dare slow down. I had to get away, had to escape the suffocating aura of wrongness and malice that permeated those woods. I hiked back to my truck as fast as I could physically manage in my exhausted, terrified state. The entire way, I couldn't shake the horrific images of the abandoned camp, the discarded clothes, the revolting piles of human waste, and most of all, that unnatural cage. It haunted me as I walked, plaguing each step with visions of the unimaginable atrocities that could have taken place in its unforgiving metal confines. Was it a torture chamber, a place to imprison and inflict unfathomable pain on the unwilling? Or perhaps a sick holding cell, where kidnapped victims were kept like animals until their captor saw fit to end their suffering? Each scenario that clawed its way through my mind was more terrible than the last, made all the worse by the pervasive sense of being watched, followed, as I fled those cursed woods. Even when I finally made it back to my truck, collapsing into the driver's seat with heaving breaths and knees nearly knocking together from freighted shakes, I couldn't let my guard down. I locked the doors immediately, actually checked the back seat like a child afraid of boogeymen, before I dared to pull out with a spray of gravel and snow. My eyes flicked compulsively to the rearview mirror as I bounced and jolted down the unpaved logging road, wholly expecting to see a figure emerge from the trees, chasing me. That same primal fear from the night before lodged in my throat. It wasn't until I pulled out onto the blessed safety of the paved highway, other vehicles and signs of humanity finally coming into view, that I was able to suck in a full breath. It felt like a massive weight was lifted from my chest, but my muscles remained locked tight, jumping at every flash of movement in my peripherals. I drove the rest of the way home in a haze of sweat-inducing anxiety and pulse-pounding adrenaline, unable to fully convince myself that I'd truly gotten away unscathed. When I got home, I immediately called the Forest Service and reported what I had found with a shaking voice and stumbling words. I could barely string together coherent sentences as I tried to convey the skin-crawling wrongness of that far-flung campsite and the malformed cage that seemed ripped from a nightmare. The ranger on the phone listened patiently, jotting down the details and GPS coordinates as I relayed them, before asking me to email any and all pictures I had taken of the scene. With still trembling hands, I plugged my phone into my computer and sent them over. The images of that rusty metal abomination and trash-strewn camp burning themselves into my retinas as I clicked through them. It felt like I was willingly reliving the traumatic experience with each photo, the yawning black maw of terror opening up inside me once more, threatening to swallow me whole. The ranger called me back after about an hour, his calm, almost nonchalant demeanor a stark contrast to my frayed nerves and residual panic. He told me it was probably just some loner living out there, maybe someone trying to escape society and live off-grid. He reasoned that the cage could be some kind of DIY animal trap, or a storage locker for food that the builder didn't want bears or other scavengers getting into. But his voice wavered slightly when I pressed him about the lack of any doors or openings in the structure, and I could tell he was just as perplexed and unsettled as I was, even if he was trying to downplay it for my benefit. He also mentioned it could possibly be the remains of an old moonshine operation or pot grow site, though he admitted the second option didn't seem likely for that particular area and time of year. I could tell he was just grasping at straws, trying to come up with any semi-logical explanation to diffuse the clinging sense of horrid unease the discovery evoked. But none of his half-baked theories did anything to ease the knots of fearful tension in my gut. The certainty that there was something deeply, disturbingly wrong with not just the cage, but the whole situation. There was a disturbing realness to it that surpassed any scary story or conjured nightmare, a grim weight that told me it wasn't just the product of my overactive imagination. I never went back to that spot, though part of me desperately wanted to at first, if only to prove to myself that it had been real and not some vivid hallucination brought on by isolation and paranoia. I thought maybe if I could see it in the clear light of day, investigate further without the choking fear clouding my mind, I could figure out what that cage was really for and put the relentless, nagging dread to rest. But another part of me, the louder, more sensible part, knew that would be a huge mistake. I had escaped that place unharmed through sheer luck and horribly timed circumstance, and I had no illusions that I'd be so fortunate a second time. something in my gut, an infallible sixth sense honed by too many close calls and near misses, warned me that going back would only lead me to whatever dark end had befallen the cage's creator. And so I stayed away, even as the nightmares plagued me for weeks, months afterwards, waking screaming and drenched in icy sweat from twisted visions of finding myself trapped inside that horrible box, unable to move or escape, forgotten in those frigid woods. I'd jolt awake, gasping, my partner shaking me and asking what was wrong, what I'd dreamed of, but I could never bring myself to describe the sheer mind-bending terror of it. I tried to move on, to chalk it up to just another bizarre, unexplained oddity I'd encountered over my years of solo hiking and camping in the backcountry. But even as time passed and the nightmares slowly faded, I couldn't shake the deep, visceral dread that had sunk its claws into me that night. It followed me like a shadow, an icy prickle at the back of my neck, a constant paranoia that had me double and triple checking locks, jumping at the sound of footsteps behind me, seeing danger and dark intent in every stranger's face. The worst part was that I never found out what happened, never got any closure or answers. The Forest Service sent a ranger out to investigate the site, but by the time they got there, a late winter snowstorm had buried all traces of the campsite and that sinister cage. They searched as best they could, but found no evidence of the horrors I had stumbled upon, no clues as to who had built it or why. It was as if the whole terrifying ordeal had been erased, swept clean by the uncaring hand of nature, leaving me to question if it had even been real at all or just a figment of my overstressed psyche. But I knew, with paralyzing certainty, that it had been all too real. The lingering psychological scars, the residual echoes of mind-numbing fear imprinted on my very soul, were testament enough to that fact. The ranger filed it away as an unsolved oddity, just another strange tale to add to the many that circulate among those who spend their lives in the untamed wilderness. But for me, it would never be just a campfire story, a thrilling anecdote to share with other outdoor enthusiasts. It would forever be a source of unshakable primal terror, a reminder that true horror exists outside the confines of fiction, lurking in the lonely, forgotten corners of our world. I still go hiking and camping, still seek out the peace and solitude of wild places. But I'm warier now, more cautious of the blank spots on the map and the paths less traveled. Because I know that the woods aren't always empty, and sometimes the things you find out there are better left unexplained and undisturbed. That cage, that awful, nightmarish thing still haunts my dreams and lurks in the darkest recesses of my mind. And as much as I try to rationalize it, to fit it into some logical framework, I know I'll never truly be free of the indelible mark it left on my psyche. The woods hold many secrets, some beautiful and awe-inspiring, others dark and terrible beyond imagining. And I know now, with grim finality, that there are some secrets that should never be uncovered, some mysteries that are best left alone to the mercy of the wilderness. That rusted metal cage, out there in the middle of nowhere, will likely remain an unsolved enigma. Its purpose, its creator, the unimaginable acts that may have occurred within its unforgiving confines, all lost to the impartial annals of nature and time. But for me, it will forever serve as a chilling reminder of the dark underbelly that lurks beneath the surface of our world, the potential for unspeakable horror that exists in the most innocuous of places. I often wonder about the person who built it, who spent weeks out there in the icy solitude doing God knows what. Were they simply a disturbed loner, grappling with their own twisted demons in the only way they knew how? Or were they something far more sinister, a predator using the remote wilderness as their own private hunting ground, leaving no trace of their dark deeds? I suppose I'll never know for sure, but what I do know is that the experience changed me, on a fundamental level. It stripped away the veil of ignorant bliss, the comforting illusion that the most remote and untouched places are free from the stain of human darkness. I can never look at the wilderness the same way, never fully shake the insidious sense that something wicked could be lurking just beyond the flicker of the campfire, waiting for its chance to strike. But even so, I refuse to let it keep me from the wild places I love so dearly. I still seek out the tranquility and raw beauty of nature, still push myself to explore the untrammeled corners of the map. Only now, I do so with a keener awareness, a honed vigilance for the signs that something may be amiss. I share my story not to spread fear, but to impart a hard-learned lesson to my fellow outdoor enthusiasts, to remind them that while the woods can offer solace and adventure, they are not always the refuge we imagine them to be. That sometimes, the most unassuming corners can hide the most unspeakable of evils. So to all those who seek out the untamed wild, I say this: tread carefully, keep your wits about you, and if you should stumble upon something that sets your very soul on edge, something that feels intrinsically, viscerally wrong, don't let your guard down. Trust that primal instinct, that ancient warning that has kept our species alive for millennia. For it's when we ignore those whispered cautions, when we venture foolishly into the domain of monsters, that we risk meeting a fate far worse than we could ever imagine. The woods keep their secrets for a reason, and some things are better left lost to their shadowy depths, never to see the light of day or the knowing eyes of civilization. As for me, I'll continue to chase the call of the wild, to seek out the untouched places and push the boundaries of my own resilience. But I'll do so with the hard-earned respect of one who has gazed into the abyss and come back forever changed. The scars on my psyche may never fully heal, but they serve as a constant reminder to never take the untamed world for granted, to never underestimate the depths of darkness that may lurk in its most remote corners. Because in the end, we are all just visitors in the vast, uncaring wilderness. And it is a realm that predates us, that will persist long after we are gone, its secrets and horrors enduring for an eternity. All we can do is adapt, learn from our brushes with the unspeakable, and never forget that we are not always the masters of our fate when we step into the untamed wild. The humid air clung to my skin as I led our small squad through the dense undergrowth. We were 6 days into what was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance mission in the jungles of Southeast Asia. But nothing about this operation had gone according to plan. Captain Rodriguez trudged beside me, his normally crisp uniform now a sodden mess. Behind us, specialists Chen and Ortiz carried our communications gear, their faces etched with exhaustion. Bringing up the rear were Privates Miller and Jackson, our youngest team members, both looking increasingly nervous as the jungle grew thicker around us. "Sir," Rodriguez murmured, "I think we need to face facts. We're lost." I nodded grimly. Our GPS had malfunctioned days ago, and the dense canopy made satellite phone communication impossible. The maps we'd been given seemed woefully inadequate for navigating this treacherous terrain. With each passing hour, I felt the weight of command pressing down on me. These men were my responsibility, and I had led them into this green hell. As dusk approached, we made camp in a small clearing. The chorus of insects and distant animal calls created an oppressive wall of sound. I assigned watch rotations and tried to project an air of confidence for the team, but inwardly, my mind raced with contingency plans. That night, I jolted awake to Miller's panicked whisper, "Sarge, there's something out there." I was on my feet in an instant, rifle at the ready. The rest of the squad stirred, alert to the tension. We peered into the inky darkness beyond our small campfire. For a moment, all was still. Then a twig snapped, followed by a low, rumbling growl that raised the hair on the back of my neck. "What the hell was that?" Ortiz hissed. Before I could answer, a pair of eyes flashed in the darkness. Too high off the ground to be a jaguar or any other predator I recognized. They glowed with an unnatural, almost phosphorescent light. "Hold your fire," I ordered, my voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody shoots unless I give the word." The eyes blinked once, then vanished. We maintained our vigilant posture for what felt like hours, but the presence didn't return. As the first hints of dawn lightened the sky, I saw the toll the night had taken on my men. Dark circles ringed their eyes, and they jumped at every rustle in the underbrush. "Pack up," I said. "We move in 10 minutes." As we broke camp, I noticed strange tracks in the soft earth at the edge of our clearing. They were canine in shape, but massive, easily the size of dinner plates. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered stories I'd heard from indigenous guides on previous missions. Tales of a creature that walked like a man but had the head of a dog, standing over 7 feet tall. I'd dismissed them as folklore, but now I shook off the thought. We were soldiers trained to deal in facts and combat realities. Whatever was out there, we'd face it together. But as we moved deeper into the jungle that morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, stalked by something that didn't belong in any rational world I knew. The day wore on, each step a battle against the suffocating heat and clinging vines. We rationed our water carefully, knowing we'd need to find a stream soon or risk dehydration. The jungle seemed to press in around us, blotting out the sun and any sense of direction. "Sarge," Chen called out, his voice tight with worry. "I think we're going in circles." I was about to dismiss his concern when I noticed a distinctive fallen log one we'd definitely passed earlier that day. My heart sank. We were indeed walking in circles, disoriented by the endless green maze. "All right, we make camp here," I announced, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "Chen, Ortiz, see if you can get that sat phone working. The rest of you establish a perimeter." As the others busied themselves with their tasks, Captain Rodriguez pulled me aside. "Level with me, Sarge. How screwed are we?" I met his gaze steadily. "We're in a tough spot, sir, but we've got good men. We'll find a way out." He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. We both knew the harsh reality search and rescue operations in this part of the world were notoriously difficult. If we couldn't get communications back online, our chances of making it out alive dwindled with each passing hour. As night fell, the jungle came alive with sounds, chittering insects, the distant roar of what might have been a jaguar, and stranger noises I couldn't identify. The men huddled close to our small fire, eyes darting nervously into the darkness. "Hey, Miller," Jackson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You ever hear about the dog man?" Miller scoffed. "That old urban legend. Come on, man." "It's not just urban," Ortiz chimed in, his usual skepticism absent from his voice. "My abuela used to tell stories about something like that, a creature that's half man, half dog. Said it stalks people who get lost in the wilderness." "Knock it off," I ordered, not wanting their imaginations to run wild. But even as I said it, I couldn't help but remember those massive tracks, the glowing eyes from the night before. A twig snapped in the darkness, and we all froze. Slowly, I reached for my rifle, signaling the others to stay quiet. For a long moment, the only sound was our own shallow breathing and the pounding of my heart in my ears. Then, from just beyond the ring of firelight, came a low, menacing growl, deeper than any dog I'd ever heard, with an almost human quality to it. Miller let out a strangled gasp, and I saw Jackson's hand shaking as he raised his weapon. "Hold steady," I whispered, scanning the tree line. That's when I saw it, a massive shape, easily 7 feet tall, moving on 2 legs at the edge of our camp. Its outline was unmistakably canine, with pointed ears and an elongated snout. But its posture, the way it moved, it was unsettlingly human-like. "What the fuck?" Rodriguez breathed beside me. The creature tilted its head, regarding us with glowing eyes that seemed to shine with intelligence. Then, in a movement almost too fast to follow, it melted back into the jungle. Did you see that?" Chen stammered. I nodded grimly. "Everyone stay alert. Whatever that thing is, it's not like any animal I've ever encountered." We spent the rest of the night in tense silence, jumping at every sound. By the time dawn broke, we were exhausted and on edge. As we broke camp, I tried to rally the men, but I could see the fear in their eyes. We were lost in a hostile jungle, being stalked by something that defied explanation. As we moved out, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being herded, driven deeper into the creature's territory. The dogman, if that's what it truly was, seemed to be playing a game with us, and I had a sinking feeling that we were nowhere near understanding the rules. The third day of our ordeal dawned gray and oppressive. A light drizzle filtered through the canopy, adding to our misery. We'd managed to find a small stream the previous afternoon, replenishing our water supplies. But food was becoming a serious concern. Our rations were dangerously low, and none of us were experienced enough in jungle survival to confidently forage. "We need to change our strategy," I announced as we gathered around a meager breakfast of protein bars. "We've been moving without a clear direction. Today we follow this stream. It has to lead somewhere." The men nodded, too exhausted for much discussion. As we set out, I noticed Miller limping slightly. The unforgiving terrain was taking its toll on all of us. For hours we slogged alongside the stream, the constant gurgle of water a counterpoint to the jungle's cacophony. Occasionally, I thought I caught glimpses of movement in the undergrowth, but whether it was our mysterious stalker or simply my overstressed imagination, I couldn't be sure. Around midday, Chen called out excitedly, "Sarge, look at this." We gathered around a large tree where Chen was pointing. Carved into the bark was a crude symbol, a stick figure with the head of a dog. "It's got to be a trail marker," Ortiz said. "Maybe there are indigenous people nearby who could help us." Captain Rodriguez frowned. "Or it could be a warning. We don't know what that symbol means." I studied the carving, noting how the edges seemed weathered. "It's old," I mused, "but it's the first sign of human activity we've seen. We follow it." As we pressed on, we began to notice more symbols, similar dog-headed figures, along with other abstract designs I couldn't decipher. They seemed to be leading us along a winding path deeper into the jungle. The foliage grew denser, the trees more gnarled and ancient-looking. The very air felt different, heavy with an otherworldly stillness that set my nerves on edge. "I don't like this," Jackson muttered. "Feels like we're walking into a trap." Before I could respond, a blood-curdling howl split the air. It was closer than ever before and held a note of triumph that chilled me to the bone. "Form up," I shouted. "Defensive positions." We barely had time to create a perimeter before the undergrowth exploded with movement. Dark shapes burst from the foliage, not just one creature, but three. They were just as I'd glimpsed before, massive, wolf-like beings that stood upright like men. Their eyes glowed with that same eerie phosphorescence, and saliva dripped from powerful jaws. "Open fire!" Rodriguez yelled, and the jungle erupted with the sound of automatic weapons. But the creatures were inhumanly fast. They dodged and weaved through the hail of bullets with preternatural agility. One of them closed on Miller before the young private could reload. With a swipe of its massive paw, it sent him flying into a tree trunk. He crumpled to the ground, motionless. "Miller!" I cried out, but there was no time to check on him. Another of the dogmen was bearing down on me, its hot breath washing over my face, as I emptied my clip into its chest. The bullet seemed to have little effect. Just as its jaws were about to close on my throat, a deafening roar shook the earth. The creature froze, then retreated along with its companions. In seconds, they had vanished back into the jungle, leaving us panting and shell-shocked. What the hell just happened?" Ortiz gasped. I shook my head, unable to process what we'd just experienced. "Check on Miller," I ordered, my voice hoarse. To our relief, Miller was alive, though badly concussed. As Chen and Jackson tended to him, I took stock of our situation. We were down to our last few magazines of ammunition, our food was nearly gone, and we'd just been attacked by creatures that, by all rights, shouldn't exist. "So," Rodriguez said, coming to stand beside me, "you think that's the dogman from the legends?" I let out a humorless laugh. "I don't know what to think anymore, Captain, but I know we can't stay here. Whatever those things are, they'll be back." As if in response to my words, another roar echoed through the jungle, deeper and more powerful than anything we'd heard before. The dogmen had retreated, but I had a sinking feeling we were about to face something far worse. "On your feet," I called to the squad. "We move now, and pray to whatever gods might be listening that we find a way out of this nightmare." As we gathered our gear and helped Miller to his feet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed some invisible boundary. We were no longer in the world we knew, but in a realm where legend and reality blurred, and our chances of making it back alive were growing slimmer by the moment. We moved through the jungle with renewed urgency, the memory of the dogmen's attack driving us forward despite our exhaustion. Miller leaned heavily on Chen and Jackson, his eyes glazed with pain and confusion. I knew we needed to find help soon, or we'd lose him. The symbols carved into the trees grew more frequent and elaborate. Some depicted scenes of hunt and battle, always featuring the dog-headed figures. Others seemed to be a form of writing, though in no alphabet I recognized. "Look at this," Rodriguez called, pointing to a particularly large carving. It showed a group of human stick figures, surrounded by the dogmen, all of them bowing before a much larger, more terrifying canine figure. "Their leader?" Ortiz suggested. I nodded grimly, and I have a feeling that's what made that roar we heard earlier. As if summoned by our words, a low growl rumbled through the undergrowth. We froze, weapons at the ready. Slowly, deliberately, a massive shape emerged from the shadows. It was like the other dogmen, but larger, easily 9 feet tall, with muscles rippling beneath matted fur. Its eyes glowed not with the phosphorescent green of the others, but with a deep, smoldering red. Around its neck hung a crude necklace of bones and teeth. "Nobody move," I whispered, though the command was hardly necessary. We were all rooted to the spot, transfixed by the creature's gaze. To my shock, the beast spoke. Its voice was a guttural rumble, the words barely recognizable as English. "You trespass." I swallowed hard, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening, and yet, "We're lost," I managed to say. "We mean no harm. We're just trying to find our way home." The creature's eyes narrowed, and I saw intelligence there, ancient and alien, but undeniably sentient. "No home for you. This place, between worlds. You stay or die." My blood ran cold. "What do you mean, between worlds?" But the dogman leader had apparently tired of conversation. With a snarl, it reared up to its full height. The jungle around us came alive with movement as more of the creatures emerged, surrounding us. "Run," I shouted, firing a burst from my rifle to buy us a few seconds. We crashed through the underbrush, half carrying Miller. I could hear the dogmen in pursuit, their howls echoing through the trees. We had no destination, no plan, just the desperate need to put distance between us and those terrifying creatures. Suddenly, the ground disappeared from beneath my feet. We tumbled down a steep embankment, landing in a shallow, fast-moving river. The current swept us along, and I struggled to keep my head above water while maintaining my grip on my weapon. "Hold on," I yelled to the others, hoping my voice carried over the rush of the water. The river carried us through a series of rapids, smashing us against rocks and fallen logs. Just when I thought we couldn't take any more, the current slowed, depositing us on a muddy bank. Coughing and sputtering, we dragged ourselves ashore. A quick head count confirmed we were all still together, though battered and soaked to the bone. "Did we lose them?" Jackson asked between gasps for air. A chorus of howls answered his question. The dogmen had followed us, their glowing eyes visible through the trees on the opposite bank. "Move," I ordered, hauling myself to my feet. "We need to find shelter, somewhere defensible." As we stumbled through the gathering darkness, the adrenaline began to wear off, and the full weight of our situation hit me. We were being hunted by creatures out of legend, in a place that their leader claimed was between worlds. Had we somehow crossed into another dimension? Was this all some collective hallucination brought on by a toxin in the jungle? I pushed the questions aside, focusing on our immediate survival. Up ahead, I spotted a dark opening in a rocky hillside, a cave. "There," I pointed. "We'll make our stand there." We hurried inside, relieved to find the cave was deep enough to provide some shelter. As Chen and Ortiz worked to build a small fire, I took stock of our remaining supplies. We had maybe a dozen rounds of ammunition between us, a few protein bars, and our canteens. It wasn't much to mount a defense against the nightmares that pursued us. "Sarge," Miller spoke up, his voice weak. "What that thing said about this place being between worlds, you think it's true?" I met his gaze, seeing the fear and desperate hope there. "I don't know, Miller, but I know this. We're soldiers. Whatever this place is, whatever those things are, we face them together, and we're not giving up." A howl echoed from the mouth of the cave, followed by the sound of heavy footfalls. The dogmen had found us. "All right, people," I said, hefting my rifle. "This is where we make our stand. Whatever happens, we fight together." The squad took up defensive positions near the mouth of the cave, our remaining ammunition distributed as evenly as possible. Miller, still dazed from his earlier injury, huddled behind us with the first aid kit, ready to tend to any wounds. The heavy footfalls grew closer, accompanied by low growls that seemed to resonate in our bones. Shadows played across the cave entrance, cast by bodies far larger than any natural animal. The acrid scent of wet fur and something wilder, something ancient, filled the air. "Hold your fire until you have a clear shot," I ordered in a hushed voice. "Make every round count." The first dogman appeared at the cave mouth, its massive form silhouetted against the dim jungle light. Its eyes gleamed with that unearthly phosphorescence, scanning the interior until they locked onto mine. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as human and inhuman gazes met. Then all hell broke loose. The creature lunged forward with impossible speed. I squeezed the trigger, the muzzle flash momentarily blinding me in the darkness of the cave. The dogman staggered but didn't fall. More of them poured in behind it, a tide of fur and fang and claw. "Fire at will," Rodriguez shouted, his voice nearly drowned out by the cacophony of gunfire and bestial roars. We fought with everything we had, but it quickly became clear we were outmatched. For every dogman that fell, two more seemed to take its place. They moved with a coordination that spoke of intelligence behind their savage exterior, flanking us and driving us deeper into the cave. "Fall back," I yelled, grabbing Miller and half-dragging him as we retreated. "There has to be another way out." We stumbled through the darkness, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind us. The cave twisted and turned, the passageway growing narrower. Just as I feared we'd reached a dead end, the tunnel opened into a vast underground cavern. What I saw there stopped me in my tracks. The cavern was illuminated by a soft, pulsing light that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Strange symbols, similar to those we'd seen carved in the trees but far more intricate, covered every surface. At the center of the chamber stood a circle of standing stones, each easily 20 feet tall. Within the circle, the air shimmered and wavered like a heat mirage. "What the hell is this place?" Ortiz breathed, his eyes wide with awe and fear. Before anyone could respond, the dogmen burst into the cavern behind us, but instead of attacking, they formed a ring around us, herding us toward the circle of stones. Their leader, the massive alpha we'd encountered earlier, stepped forward. "You choose," it growled, gesturing toward the shimmering air within the stone circle. "Stay, or go." I looked at my team, saw the exhaustion and terror etched on their faces. We were out of ammunition, out of options. Whatever lay beyond that shimmering veil couldn't be worse than being torn apart by these creatures. "We go together," I said firmly, meeting each of their eyes in turn. They nodded, a flicker of hope kindling in their expressions. As one, we stepped into the circle. The air around us grew thick, making it hard to breathe. Colors swirled and blended, reality itself seeming to warp and twist. I felt a sensation of falling, of being stretched and compressed all at once. Then, suddenly, it was over. We found ourselves standing on solid ground, blinking in bright sunlight. The sounds of traffic and distant voices reached my ears, human voices. We were in a small park surrounded by buildings I recognized. Somehow, impossibly, we were back in the city where our base was located. For a long moment, we stood in stunned silence, trying to process what had happened. Then Miller let out a choked laugh, which quickly turned into sobs of relief. The rest of us weren't far behind, the tension of our ordeal finally breaking. As sirens approached, someone must have called the authorities upon seeing a group of bedraggled soldiers appear out of thin air. I looked at my team with a mixture of pride and lingering disbelief. "We made it," I said simply. Rodriguez nodded, a wry smile on his dirt-streaked face. "Yeah, but who's going to believe our after-action report?" I laughed, the sound bordering on hysterical. He was right. There was no way to explain what we'd been through, what we'd seen. The world of military bureaucracy and debriefing seemed a million miles away from the primal terror of the jungle and the dogmen. As paramedics and MPs swarmed around us, I caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw a large, wolf-like shape watching us from the shadows of a nearby alley. But when I turned for a better look, it was gone. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the truth. We might have escaped, but the boundary between our world and that other wilder place was thinner than I'd ever imagined. The dogmen were out there, lurking in the spaces between reality, and somehow I knew our paths would cross again. But for now, we were home. We were alive. And that was enough. As the MPs began to lead us away for what would undoubtedly be a very long debriefing, I took one last look at the park where we'd emerged. The sun glinted off the windows of the surrounding buildings, a testament to the ordered, rational world we'd returned to. Yet in my mind's eye, I could still see the glowing eyes of the dogmen, still feel the oppressive weight of that jungle that existed somewhere beyond the veil of our reality. We had survived an encounter with the impossible, but as I turned away, I couldn't shake the feeling that our adventure in the realm of the dogmen was far from over. It was simply the beginning of a much larger story, one that blurred the lines between myth and reality, between the world we thought we knew and the ancient primal forces that lurked just out of sight. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew one thing for certain. Our squad had been forged into something stronger in that jungle crucible. We had faced the legendary Dogman and lived to tell the tale. And if the day came when we had to venture into that twilight realm again, we would face it together, as brothers in arms who had seen the impossible and emerged stronger for it. The debriefing awaited, and with it, the challenge of explaining the unexplainable. But that was a battle for another day. For now, we breathed in the air of our own world, grateful for every moment, and forever changed by our encounter with the wild jungle and its mythical guardians. It was the summer of 2002, and the Wyoming wilderness beckoned as it always did, vast and untamed under an endless azure sky. My name is Wade Harkins, and for most of my 40-odd years, this rugged landscape has been both my home and my office. As a hunting guide, I've made my living leading men, typically city types hungry for a taste of the old ways, into the backcountry in search of elk, mule deer, pronghorn, whatever's in season. It's not an easy living, but it's an honest one. Out here, you come to understand that we aren't separate from nature, no matter how much steel and concrete we surround ourselves with. Here, we are very much a part of the food chain. This particular trip began like many others. I was hired by a group of 3 men who clearly spent more time in boardrooms than in the woods. The leader of the group was a blustery fellow by the name of Pete Winslow. He had the look of old money, expensive gear, a meticulously groomed beard, and an air of easy confidence that bordered on arrogance. His companions, Troy and Clark, seemed content to let Pete do the talking. "I hope you're ready to work for your pay," Pete said to me as we loaded up the horses at the trailhead. "I didn't come all the way out here to go home empty-handed." I just nodded, a tight smile on my weathered face. I've guided enough trophy hunters to know the type. Big talkers who expect the forest to lay down and present its bounty like a waiter offering a platter of hors d'oeuvres. But the wild doesn't work that way. Out here, you get what you earn. We set off early, the morning mist still clinging to the pines as we rode out. Our destination was a remote valley, about a day's ride from the nearest road. It's a place I've been dozens of times, known for its lush meadows and healthy herds of elk. The plan was to make base camp by nightfall and start the hunt at first light. As we rode, Pete kept up a steady stream of chatter, regaling us with tales of his past hunting exploits, the trophies on his wall, the records he'd broken. I half listened, my attention more focused on the forest around us. There was a stillness in the air, a sense of watchful silence that prickled the hairs on the back of my neck. I've spent enough time in these woods to trust my instincts, and right now, they were telling me that something wasn't quite right. We made camp in a small clearing just as the sun was starting to dip behind the western peaks. As the others set up their tents and started a fire, I stood at the edge of the clearing, looking out into the forest. The silence was almost deafening. No bird calls, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Just an eerie, watchful quiet. "You all right, Wade?" Pete asked, coming to stand beside me. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease that had settled in my gut. Just tired, I guess. It's been a long day. Pete chuckled, clapping me on the shoulder. Well, get some rest. Tomorrow, we hunt. As I lay in my tent that night, listening to the crackle of the dying fire and the soft snores of the men, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone out here, that something, hidden and hungry, was watching us from the darkness of the trees. Little did I know then just how right I was. Dawn came cold and crisp, the sun a pale sliver on the eastern horizon as we broke camp and set out. We rode in silence, our breath misting in the chill air. The only sound, the creak of leather and the clop of hooves on the hard-packed trail. I led the way, guiding us higher into the mountains, towards the grassy basins where I knew the elk liked to graze. The plan was to split up once we reached the hunting grounds, each of us taking a different section of the valley to maximize our chances. It was mid-morning by the time we reached the spot, a wide, sloping meadow framed by stands of lodgepole pine and granite cliffs. We dismounted, tying off the horses and checking our gear. Pete was practically vibrating with anticipation, his eyes bright and eager as he loaded his rifle. All right, I said, here's how it's going to work. Pete, you and Troy head west, towards that ridgeline. Clark and I will take the east side. Stay within earshot, and if you get something, fire 3 shots in quick succession. We'll come find you. Pete nodded, already moving off with Troy at his heels. I watched them go, then turned to Clark. Ready? He nodded, shouldering his pack, and we set off into the trees. The morning passed quietly as we picked our way through the underbrush, eyes peeled for any sign of game. But the forest remained still and silent, as if holding its breath. Even the usual chatter of squirrels and birdsong was absent, leaving only the sound of our own footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves. Around noon, we stopped for a break on a small rise overlooking the valley. As I was unpacking some jerky from my pack, a sudden movement in the trees below caught my eye. I froze, staring hard into the shadows of the pines. For a moment, I thought I saw something large moving through the underbrush, something that moved with a swift, loping gait that was neither wholly bear nor wholly human. Wade? What is it? Clark asked, his voice tense. I shook my head, blinking hard. When I looked again, the shape was gone, leaving only a swaying branch and a prickling sense of unease in its wake. Nothing, I said, though I could hear the lie in my own voice. Probably just a deer. Clark looked unconvinced, but didn't press the issue. We ate in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. It was soon after that we heard the shots, 3 quick blasts in close succession, echoing off the cliffs. Pete and Troy. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. Come on, I said, already moving. We'd better go check on them. We found them in a small clearing about a quarter mile from where we'd left them. They were standing over something on the ground, their faces pale and drawn. As we got closer, I saw what it was and felt my stomach lurch. It was a carcass, or what was left of one. It had been a living thing once, that much was clear, but now it was little more than a tangle of bloody fur and splintered bone, torn asunder as if by some immense savage force. Scraps of flesh clung to the exposed ribs, glistening obscenely in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the pines. Pete turned to us as we approached, his face ashen. What the hell could have done this? He asked, his voice shaking. A bear? A mountain lion? I shook my head, unable to tear my eyes away from the grisly sight. No bear or lion did this, I said softly. This is something else. Something wrong. And even as I said it, I could feel that watchful presence from the night before, lurking just beyond the edge of the clearing, watching us, waiting. The trek back to camp was a somber one. Pete and Troy led the way, their earlier bravado replaced with a grim silence. Clark followed close behind, his face drawn and pensive. I brought up the rear, my senses straining for any sign of movement in the underbrush, any hint of the presence I could still feel dogging our steps. We reached the clearing just as the sun was starting to dip behind the western peaks, painting the sky in lurid shades of orange and red. The horses were where we'd left them, grazing peacefully at the edge of the tree line. But as we drew closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on the ground near the smoldering remains of last night's fire, was a set of tracks. They were large, easily twice the size of a man's hand, and they sank deep into the soft earth. But it was their shape that truly unsettled me. They were vaguely humanoid, but with long, curved claws at the tips of each toe. And they were fresh. "What the hell?" Pete muttered, dropping to one knee to examine the tracks. "What kind of animal makes a print like this?" I shook my head, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's been here, in our camp." A heavy silence fell over the group as the implication sank in. We were miles from civilization, alone in the wilderness with something that defied explanation, something that had already proven itself to be lethal. "We should leave," Clark said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "Get back to town, report this to the authorities." Pete stood, dusting off his hands. "And tell them what? That we found a mangled carcass and some weird footprints? They'll think we're crazy. No, we came out here to hunt, and that's what we're going to do. We'll just be more careful, that's all." I wanted to argue, to insist that we cut our losses and head back, but I could see the determination in Pete's eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw. He wasn't going to be swayed, not by me or anyone else. "All right," I said at last. "But we stick together from here on out. No more splitting up. And we keep a watch at night, in pairs." The others nodded, some more reluctantly than others, and we set about making camp for the night. But even as we went through the familiar motions, pitching tents, gathering firewood, cooking dinner over the flames, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something out there in the darkness was biding its time, waiting for its moment to strike. As I sat by the fire that night, staring out into the blackness beyond the reach of the flickering light, I found myself thinking back to the stories I'd heard as a child. The old tales that the elders would tell around the fire, tales of things that lurked in the shadows of the forest, things that were neither wholly animal nor wholly man, but something in between, something ancient and hungry and utterly without mercy. I'd always dismissed those stories as mere folklore, the superstitions of a bygone era. But now, huddled in the wild heart of the mountains, with a very real and present threat lurking just beyond the firelight, I found myself wondering if perhaps those old tales held more truth than I'd ever dared to believe. Sleep was a elusive thing that night. Despite the weariness in my bones, I found myself lying awake, staring at the canvas roof of my tent as the night sounds of the forest played out around me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline surging through my veins. My body tensed for a fight that never came. I was on watch with Troy, the two of us sitting back to back at the edge of the clearing, our rifles resting across our knees. We didn't talk much, both of us too wrapped up in our own thoughts, our own fears, to make much in the way of conversation. It was sometime in the small hours of the morning, that deep, still time when the night seems at its darkest, that I saw it, a shadow moving through the trees at the far edge of the clearing. It was big, far larger than a man, and it moved with a strange, loping gait that sent a chill down my spine. I elbowed Troy, nodding towards the tree line. He followed my gaze, his eyes widening as he caught sight of the shape moving through the shadows. "What the fuck is that?" he whispered, his voice tight with fear. I shook my head, my finger tightening on the trigger of my rifle. "I don't know, but it's coming this way." We watched in breathless silence as the shape drew closer, its movements becoming more distinct as it neared the edge of the firelight. It was humanoid, that much was clear, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, its legs too short and bowed. And its head was a thing of nightmares, a twisted mass of fur and teeth and glinting feral eyes. It paused at the edge of the clearing, seeming to sniff the air. Then, with a suddenness that made us both flinch, it turned its head and looked directly at us. In that moment, I felt a fear unlike anything I've ever known before or since. It was primal, visceral, a cold hand closing around my heart. Because in those eyes, in that savage, alien gaze, I saw an intelligence, a cruel, predatory awareness that knew nothing of mercy or compassion. The creature held our gaze for a long, terrible moment. Then, with a soft huff that might have been a laugh, it turned and melted back into the shadows, as silent and insubstantial as a ghost. Troy and I sat in stunned silence for a long minute, our hearts pounding, our breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, Troy spoke. "We have to get out of here," he said, his voice shaking. "We have to get out of here right now." I didn't argue. I knew, with a certainty that went beyond reason or logic, that if we stayed in these woods, we would die. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. The thing out there, whatever it was, would not rest until it had us. We woke the others, quickly and quietly packing up camp. There were questions, of course, confusion and fear in equal measure. But one look at our faces, at the raw, animal terror in our eyes, was enough to quell any protests. We rode out as the first pale fingers of dawn were reaching over the eastern peaks, the morning mist swirling around the horses' legs as we urged them down the trail. None of us spoke, our eyes fixed straight ahead, our ears straining for any sound of pursuit. But the forest was silent, still, as if holding its breath. Whatever had stalked us in the night, it seemed content to let us go, at least for now. I didn't relax until we reached the trailhead, the sight of the old pickup truck parked where we'd left it a welcome relief. Even then, as we loaded the horses and climbed wearily into the cab, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd barely escaped with our lives, that we'd brushed up against something ancient and malevolent, something that had let us go more out of caprice than any sense of mercy. As we pulled away, gravel crunching under the tires, I glanced back at the forest rising behind us, a dark wall of pine and shadow, and I knew with a bone-deep certainty that I would never set foot in those woods again. That there were some places man was never meant to tread, some secrets best left buried in the deep, silent places of the earth. But even as I watched the trees recede in the rearview mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that whatever we had awakened in that lonely mountain valley, it would not rest, would not forget, and that someday, whether by chance or design, our paths would cross again. The drive back to town was a blur, my mind still reeling from the events of the past few days. Pete sat in the passenger seat, his face a mask of grim determination, while Troy and Clark huddled in the back, speaking in low, urgent whispers. We reached Dubois by mid-afternoon, the sleepy little town a welcome sight after the wild isolation of the mountains. We reported what had happened to the local authorities, the mangled carcass, the strange tracks, the creature that had stalked us in the night. They listened with a mix of skepticism and concern, promising to send out a search party to investigate. But I could see it in their eyes, the same look I'd seen in the eyes of so many others over the years, the look that said they thought we were exaggerating at best, outright lying at worst. Just another group of city boys who'd let their imaginations run wild in the big, bad woods. I didn't try to convince them. Truthfully, a part of me hoped they were right, that it had all been some kind of collective hallucination, a trick of the light and the mind. But deep down, I knew better. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt, and I knew that it was real. The others left town that same day, eager to put as much distance between themselves and the mountains as possible. They shook my hand before they left, their grips firm and their eyes haunted. "Take care of yourself, Wade," Pete said, his voice uncharacteristically somber. "And if you know what's good for you, you'll stay the hell out of those woods." I nodded, watching as they climbed into their rental car and drove off, the taillights fading into the gathering dusk. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to put the whole thing behind me. I threw myself into my work, guiding trips closer to town, sticking to well-trodden trails and well-marked paths. I told myself I was being practical, that I was just doing my job. But the truth was, I was scared. Scared of what I had seen, of what might still be out there, waiting and watching. It was about a month after our ill-fated hunting trip that the disappearances started. At first it was just a few scattered reports, hikers who hadn't returned from the trails, campers who'd vanished in the night. The authorities searched, of course, but they never found anything. No trace, no clues, just empty campsites and abandoned gear. Then the bodies started turning up. What was left of them, anyway. They were found by chance, by hikers or hunters who'd strayed off the beaten path. They were torn apart, ravaged in a way that no natural predator could manage. The same strange tracks were found nearby, those huge humanoid prints sunk deep into the soft earth. A sense of dread settled over the town, a creeping unease that grew with each passing day. People started whispering about the old stories, the legends that had been passed down through generations. Stories of creatures that walked like men but hunted like beasts, of dark things that lurked in the shadows of the forest. I tried to stay out of it, to keep my head down and my mouth shut. But people talked, and word got around that I'd been one of the last to see the wilderness before the disappearances started. There were questions, suspicious looks, whispered accusations when people thought I couldn't hear. I knew I couldn't stay silent forever, that I had a responsibility both to the truth and to the people of this town that had been my home for so long. So I started talking, sharing my story with anyone who would listen. Some believed me, their eyes wide with fear and understanding. Others scoffed, dismissing me as just another crackpot, a man who'd spent too long in the woods and let his mind wander. But I persisted, driven by a need I couldn't fully explain, a need to warn, to prepare, to ensure that what had happened to us wouldn't happen to anyone else. Because I knew, with a certainty that went beyond reason or doubt, that the creature was still out there, that it was smart and patient and very, very hungry, and that it would keep hunting, keep killing, until it was stopped or until there was nothing left to hunt. I didn't know what it would take to stop it, if such a thing was even possible. But I knew I had to try, for the sake of the town, for the sake of all those who had been lost, and all those who might yet be lost. And so I prepared, I planned, and I waited. Waited for the moment when I would have to confront the thing that had haunted my dreams and stalked my waking hours. The moment when I would have to descend once more into the deep, dark heart of the forest and face the nightmare that waited there. The moment when I would have to become the hunter once again, in a desperate bid to save us all from the hunted. I spent the next few weeks in a flurry of preparation, my every waking moment consumed by the task at hand. I pored over old maps of the area, marking out the sites of the disappearances, trying to discern a pattern in the seemingly random attacks. I spoke with the old-timers, the ones who had lived in Dubois their whole lives, listening to their stories and their warnings with a new ear. And I trained. I've always been handy with a rifle, but I knew that alone wouldn't be enough. So I practiced, honing my skills with a variety of weapons, knives, handguns, even a crossbow I'd picked up from a hunter passing through town. I needed to be ready for anything, prepared for any eventuality. As the days ticked by and the disappearances continued, a grim resolve settled over me. I knew I was the only one who could do this, the only one who had seen the creature and lived to tell the tale. It was a heavy burden, but one I was determined to bear. Finally, on a cold, clear morning in late October, I set out. I left before dawn, my pickup loaded with gear and supplies, a note left on my kitchen table in case I didn't return. I drove to the trailhead, the same one where our hunting trip had begun all those weeks ago, and sat for a long moment, staring out at the misty expanse of the forest. Then, with a deep breath and a silent prayer, I shouldered my pack and stepped into the trees. The first few hours passed uneventfully as I made my way deeper into the wilderness, following the same route we had taken on that fateful trip. The forest was quiet, still, the only sound the crunch of my boots on the frosty ground, and the soft puff of my breath in the chill air. But as I neared the area where we'd first encountered the creature, a strange sensation began to creep over me. A feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking my every move. I paused, scanning the trees around me, but saw nothing. Just the endless ranks of pines, their boughs heavy with the season's first snow. I pressed on, my senses straining for any hint of danger. And then, as I crested a small rise, I saw it. A shape, moving through the trees below me. It was big, loping along on all fours with a strange, jerky gait. And it was heading straight for me. I dropped to one knee, bringing my rifle to my shoulder in one smooth motion. The creature paused, seeming to sense my presence. It raised its head, sniffing the air, and I caught a glimpse of its face. Those same feral, intelligent eyes, that same twisted mass of teeth and fur. For a long, tense moment, we stared at each other across the snowy expanse. Then, with a snarl that sent a chill down my spine, the creature charged. I fired, the shot echoing off the surrounding peaks. The creature stumbled but didn't fall, its momentum carrying it forward. I fired again and again, the bullets tearing into its flesh, but still it came on, closing the distance with a speed that defied belief. And then it was on me, a whirlwind of claws and teeth and fur. I felt a searing pain in my shoulder as its claws raked across my flesh, felt the hot rush of blood down my arm. But I didn't falter, didn't hesitate. I brought the butt of my rifle up, smashing it into the creature's face with all the strength I could muster. It reeled back, stunned, and I pressed my advantage. I lunged forward, my hunting knife flashing in my hand as I buried it to the hilt in the creature's chest. It let out a shriek of pain and rage, its claws scrabbling at me as it tried to break free. But I held on, driving the knife deeper, twisting it with a savage yell. The creature convulsed, its strength ebbing as its lifeblood poured out onto the snow. And then, with a final shuddering gasp, it went still. I staggered back, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my shoulder a blaze of pain. But as I looked down at the still form of the creature, a sense of grim triumph welled up inside me. I had done it. I had faced the nightmare and emerged victorious. But even as I stood there, the adrenaline fading and the pain of my wounds beginning to register, a troubling thought occurred to me. The creature I had killed, as formidable as it had been alone, a solitary hunter prowling its territory. But the old stories, the legends that had haunted this forest for generations, spoke of more than one, of a pack, a family of these creatures, working together to bring down their prey. And if that were true, if there were more of these things out there, I shook my head, pushing the thought aside. I had to get back to town, had to warn the others, had to make sure that this at least was the end of it. But even as I began the long, painful trek back through the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the true horror, the real fight, was yet to come. I made it back to town just as the sun was setting, my clothes torn and bloodied, my shoulder a throbbing mass of pain. I stumbled into the sheriff's office, startling the young deputy behind the desk. "Jesus, Wade," he exclaimed, leaping to his feet. "What happened to you?" I shook my head, my voice a hoarse rasp. "I found it, the thing that's been taking people. I killed it." The deputy's eyes went wide, his face pale. You're sure? It's dead?" I nodded, wincing as the movement sent a fresh wave of pain through my shoulder. "I'm sure. But there might be more. We need to warn people, My words were cut off by a sudden commotion outside, a rising babble of voices and the wail of sirens. The deputy and I exchanged a look of alarm, then rushed to the window. The street outside was chaos, people running and shouting, pointing towards the forest edge at the end of town. And there, just visible in the fading light, were shapes, dark, loping shapes, moving with a speed and purpose that sent a chill through my veins. "Oh my God," the deputy whispered, his face ashen. "There's more of them." I felt a sinking sensation in the pit of my stomach, a sickening realization of just how badly I had underestimated the threat. I had killed one, yes, but it had only been a scout, a lone hunter. The real danger, the true horror, was only now revealing itself. I turned to the deputy, my voice urgent. "Sound the alarm. Get everyone to the community center. It's the most defensible building in town. And get on the radio, call for help. State police, National Guard, anyone you can reach." He nodded, his hands shaking as he reached for the phone. I turned back to the window, watching as the shapes drew closer, their movements becoming more distinct in the gathering darkness. They were coming, a pack of nightmare creatures descending on the town like a plague. And I knew with a grim certainty that the fight of our lives was about to begin. I retrieved my truck from the station lot, loading what weapons and ammunition I had left. And then I took up position at the end of Main Street, my rifle resting on the hood of the truck, my eyes fixed on the tree line. Around me, the town was a hive of activity, people rushing to board up windows and doors to gather what weapons they could. I saw men I'd known my whole life, men who'd never so much as raised their voice in anger, gripping shotguns and baseball bats with white-knuckled intensity. And then, as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars began to wink into existence, they came. They poured out of the trees like a flood, a seething mass of fur and claws and teeth. I opened fire, my rifle bucking against my shoulder, the muzzle flash lighting up the night like a strobe. Beside me, others took up the fight, a ragged volley of gunfire echoing off the buildings. The creatures fell, some dropping in mid-stride, others staggering on for a few paces before collapsing. But still they came, seeming to absorb the bullets like raindrops. Their advance barely slowed. They hit the line of vehicles we'd positioned as a barricade, clambering over them with an agility that defied their size. I saw one of them, a huge, shaggy beast with eyes that glinted with a feral intelligence, leap onto the roof of a car and then launch itself into the midst of a knot of defenders. The men scattered, screaming, as the creature tore into them with a savagery that turned my stomach. I pivoted, trying to draw a bead on it, but it was too fast, too erratic in its movements. And then, with a sickening crunch of bone and a spray of blood, it was gone, bounding away in search of fresh prey. All around me, the battle raged, the night echoing with the sounds of carnage and chaos. I saw men I'd known since childhood fall beneath the creature's claws, saw the streets of my hometown run red with blood. And through it all, a grim realization began to dawn on me. We were losing. Despite our best efforts, despite the bravery and desperation with which we fought, the creatures were too strong, too fast, too numerous. They were going to overwhelm us, going to tear through the town until there was nothing left but corpses and rubble. Unless... A desperate plan began to form in my mind, a last-ditch gambit born of equal parts desperation and madness. I turned to the man beside me, a burly firefighter named Tom, and shouted over the din of battle, "Tom, we need to fall back, need to get everyone to the community center." He looked at me like I was crazy, his face splattered with blood and soot. "Fall back? We can't give up, not now, we have to." "Listen to me," I yelled, grabbing his arm. "We can't win this, not like this. But I have an idea, a way to end it once and for all, but I need you to trust me." For a long moment he stared at me, his eyes searching mine. Then, with a grim nod, he turned and began shouting orders, rallying the defenders for a fighting retreat. As we fell back through the streets, the creatures harrying us at every turn, I prayed that my plan would work. Prayed that the sacrifice I was about to make would be enough to save the people I cared about, the town that had been my home for so long. And as we barricaded ourselves inside the community center, as the creatures battered at the doors and windows with a fury that shook the very foundations of the building, I knew that one way or another, this would be the end. The end of the nightmare, the end of the hunt. One way or another, it would all be over soon. Inside the community center, the atmosphere was one of barely controlled panic. People huddled together in small groups, some weeping quietly, others muttering prayers, or cradling makeshift weapons with white-knuckled intensity. The sounds of the creatures outside, their snarls and howls and the relentless pounding of their assault, filled the air like a hellish symphony. I made my way through the crowd, my mind racing as I finalized the details of my plan. It was risky, desperate, and more than a little crazy. But it was the only way, the only chance we had. I found the sheriff, a grizzled veteran named Jim, and pulled him aside. Quickly, in hushed tones, I outlined my idea. He listened, his face growing more and more grim with each word. "You're sure about this, Wade?" he asked when I'd finished, his voice heavy with doubt. "It's a hell of a gamble." I nodded, my jaw set. "I'm sure. It's the only way. If we stay here, we're dead. All of us. This is the only chance we have to end this, once and for all." He held my gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, what do you need?" "Gasoline," I said. "As much as you can find. And volunteers. I need people to help me set the trap." He nodded again, then turned and began barking orders. Within minutes, a small group had gathered around me, their faces a mix of fear and determination. Together, we slipped out the back of the building, moving as quietly as we could through the shadows. We made our way to the gas station on the edge of town, the pumps long since run dry, but the storage tanks still holding a precious reserve. We worked quickly, filling every container we could find, then began the perilous journey back to the community center. The creatures were everywhere, prowling the streets like malevolent shadows, their eyes glinting in the darkness. But we were careful, moving from cover to cover, using every trick I'd learned in my years in the woods to avoid detection. Finally, we made it back, slipping inside with our precious cargo. We began to work, spreading the gasoline throughout the building, dousing every surface, every nook and cranny. The fumes were overpowering, making our eyes water and our heads spin. But we pressed on, driven by a desperate, unyielding resolve. As the last of the gasoline was poured, I turned to the others, my voice low and urgent. "All right, here's the plan. We're going to open the doors, let them in. And when they're all inside, when the building is full of them, we light it up." There was a moment of stunned silence, then a babble of fearful protest. But I held up my hand, my voice rising above the din. "Listen to me. This is the only way. If we try to fight them, we die. If we run, we die. This is the only chance we have to take them all out at once, to end this nightmare once and for all." I was standing in the middle of a dense, overgrown forest in western Oregon, trying to figure out how the hell I ended up here. When I was younger, I spent a lot of time in places like this, trekking through the wilderness with my uncle who used to work as a forest ranger. He taught me to appreciate the quiet danger of the wild, the way it could be both breathtakingly beautiful and deadly at the same time. Those early lessons served me well over the years. I guess you could say they're what made me so good at my job now, hunting things that most people never even realized existed outside of campfire stories and dark legends. My name is Travis Fenwick, and I'm part of a specialized unit that operates under the radar, far from the eyes of the public or any official oversight. You won't find records of us in any government database. We're the sort of ghosts that only exist in whispers passed between those who've seen what really hides in the shadows at the fringes of the map. What we deal with are cryptids, creatures of myth and folklore that aren't supposed to be real, but are, and they're dangerous. I'd been called in to investigate a series of strange disappearances and animal mutilations in the Tillamook State Forest. Local authorities were stumped. It was a vast, remote wilderness known for its misty beauty, but also steeped in dark history and unsettling tales passed down through generations. Loggers told stories of a creature that lurked in the deep woods, something huge and feral that could rip a man limb from limb. Old-timers spoke of settlers and native tribes that went missing without a trace. At first glance, the handful of unexplained incidents in the area seemed like tragic but unremarkable accidents. People get lost in the woods sometimes. Hikers stumble into bear dens or off unmarked trails. It happens, but certain details stood out to me. The savagery of the wounds on the recovered bodies, the absence of tracks around the scenes, the way it seemed to strike with uncanny stealth, leaving no survivors or witnesses. I'd seen this before, or at least something like it. My instincts told me we weren't dealing with a normal predator, but something much older and smarter. And based on the lore I'd dug up, I had a hunch what it might be. The Kayeshi. The name surfaced in some of the earliest stories from the land's native people. Later accounts from fur trappers and frontiersmen described a massive wolf-like creature with eerie intelligence that could hunt unseen and vanish like mist. Unlike Sasquatch or other famed cryptids, this one didn't have a cute nickname. People spoke of it only in hushed tones, if at all. There was something about how it killed that wasn't right. Ritualistic, vindictive even. Now it seemed to be back, haunting the same primordial forest it always had. It wasn't the first time I'd tracked something out of a nightmare, but this felt different, like the forest itself carried a sense of malice. The reports I was reading painted a grim picture. Not just a rogue beast on a killing spree, but something that knew how to hunt us, how to terrify us. I gathered my team and we headed in, just 4 of us, packing enough munitions and arcane warding spells to, hopefully, bag this thing. My buddy Hank, an ex-Marine built like a tank, would never admit it, but I knew even he was nervous. Sarah, our tracker who could anticipate a tiger by its shadow, kept glancing over her shoulder at sounds only she could hear. Chris, the team's technical expert, had gone quieter than usual, double and triple checking his equipment. Not that I blamed any of them. We were about to wade into the briar patch to face an ancient apex predator that had stalked this land since before the first songs were sung to keep the dark at bay. And if half of what those faded first-hand accounts claimed was true, it had a taste for human fear. We all wore stoic faces, but I could feel the unease rippling beneath the surface. So there I stood, at the shadowed maw of one of the continent's most untamed forests, with only a few clawed bones and my team's skills and courage between us, and something that wanted to pull our world back into fearful whispers around a flickering fire. Hank flashed me a tight grin. Sarah nodded like she was accepting an unspoken challenge, and Chris just looked determined to be done with this so he could get back to his Wall Street numbers. I took a deep breath, the green cathedral hush of the forest heavy in my lungs, and motioned for them to move ahead of me. It was time to pit science against superstition and pray we weren't already too late. The quiet of the forest pressed in around us as we made our way deeper into the Tillamook, following the overgrown remains of an old hunting trail. The air grew thick and soupy, each breath more labored than the last. Even the usual sounds of nature, the bird songs and leaf rustle, were muted, as if the residents of this emerald world knew better than to draw attention to themselves. It was a feeling I'd come to associate with the hunting grounds of monsters. We'd split into teams of 2 to cover more ground, with Hank and Sarah ranging ahead while Chris and I brought up the rear. The idea was to locate any fresh sign and regroup to strategize our approach. Simple enough in theory, but the gnawing in my gut told me it wouldn't be that clean. The Kaiaishi had been doing this dance for centuries. It wouldn't be caught off guard by a 4-person band of high-tech monster chasers. Chris must have sensed my unease. He shot me a quizzical look as he adjusted the pack laden with his surveillance gear. "What's eating you, Trav? We've dealt with some real cryptozoological nasties before. Chupacabras, bayou ghouls, even that rogue skinwalker out in the painted desert. How's this different?" I appreciated his attempt to cut through the tension, but it rang hollow in the gloom beneath those towering Douglas firs. "Just a feeling," I said, scanning the green tangle for any flicker of movement. "The lore on this one, it's not like the others. More personal somehow, like it's not just some unthinking beast." "What, you're saying it plots, strategizes?" There was an uncertain half-laugh behind his words, a slim shield against the strangeness of it all. I didn't answer right away, didn't know how to put into words the certainty that had been growing since I first opened this case file. Finally, I just shrugged. Maybe, or maybe it's just really old and really angry. Either way, underestimating it would be a mistake. We lapsed back into silence then, picking our way over gnarled roots and rocky outcrops. The old stories spun through my head as we walked, fragments and recurring themes stitching themselves together. A shape in the fog, eyes that shone with uncanny knowing. The wrenching loss that followed its appearances, resonating through history like ripples from a stone cast into a still pool. And then, shredding the heavy quiet like claws through flesh, a distant scream pierced the forest. Sarah's scream. Hank's wordless bellow followed a beat later, booming through the trees. Chris and I froze for the space of a shared heartbeat, the echoes of our teammates' distress still ringing in our ears. I saw my own dawning horror mirrored on his face. "Hank! Sarah!" I keyed my radio as we broke into a dead run, boots churning the loamy earth. "Report! What's your status?" The only answer was a static-filled silence that went on far too long, finally broken by Hank's panting voice, audibly shaken even through the tinny speaker. "It came out of nowhere, Trav. Fast. Got Sarah. She's gone, man. It took her A cold, sinking dread knotted in my stomach. I'd seen what even young, inexperienced cryptids could do in close quarters. I didn't want to imagine what a primordial nightmare like the Kyashi could inflict. "Is it still there? Do you have eyes on it?" I demanded. "Negative. It disappeared back into the brush, like a damn ghost. What the hell is this thing, Trav?" Hank's voice had taken on a hollowness I'd never heard from him before, and it chilled me more than the thought of what we were facing. If it could rattle Hank, the human equivalent of a battleship. I swallowed hard, exchanging a grim glance with Chris. "Stay where you are. We're coming to you. Keep watch and stay alert." I cut the connection and poured on more speed, leaping over fallen branches and ducking whip-like vines. As I ran, the old stories and reports snapped into focus, painting a clearer picture. The Kyashi didn't just kill, it stalked, it hunted. More than just a predator, it was something that lived for the chase, for the slow, creeping terror of its prey. And now, as the forest blurred around me and my heart jackhammered in my ears, one appalling realization crystallized. The Kyashi wasn't just hunting us. It was herding us deeper into its domain, into the primeval heart of the forest where its legend was born, where it was the unquestioned apex, the undisputed nightmare made flesh, where no help could reach us, and no light could banish its shadow. We had walked, willingly, into the monster's lair, and like a Venus flytrap closing around a hapless insect, the forest seemed to swallow us, cutting off any path of retreat with a suffocating malice. The hunt was on, and we were no longer the hunters. We were the hunted, and the odds of us all making it out alive had just narrowed to a hoarse, ragged whisper of a prayer. We found Hank half a click from the ambush site, his back to one of the massive ancient trees that formed a loose perimeter. Even with his camo patterns and shielding wardings, he stood out like a felled redwood amidst the clinging underbrush. His rifle was up, panning the green curtain, but I could see the minute tremors in his hands as we approached. "Hank," I called out softly, pitching my voice just above the ambient forest noise. "It's us." He didn't lower his weapon. Not at first. That, more than anything, told me how badly the encounter had shaken him. When he finally let the rifle drop, his weathered face was ashen beneath the mask of sweat and grime. "Came from fucking nowhere," he bit out, his voice like ground glass. "Snatched Sarah right out from under me. Didn't even have time to get a shot off." I didn't have to ask him to clarify. There would have been blood, sign of a struggle. But Hank wasn't splashed with gore, and the forest floor around the tree was pristine, just a scattering of leaves over dark, soft earth. The Kyashi had taken Sarah as cleanly as a magician's trick, leaving no trace. "What did it look like?" I asked. "Did you get a visual?" Hank shook his head, the motion tight and jerky. "Just a blur. Big, though. Didn't move like a normal animal." I'd expected as much. The witness reports, what scant few there were, all said the same. A hulking shadow, there and gone between one blink and the next. Some who'd gotten a longer look described a creature that was wolf-like, but stretched and distorted, as if reflected in a cracked mirror. Either way, it was becoming clear we weren't equipped for this. Not by a long shot. "So what now?" Chris asked, his voice brittle with the strain of keeping calm. "We're down a team member, we've lost the initiative, and we're balls deep in this thing's turf. Please tell me there's a plan that doesn't involve us getting picked off one by one." I grimaced, feeling the weight of their eyes on me. They were looking to me for answers, for direction, for hope, and I was coming up short on all fronts. "We stick together," I said finally. "No more splitting up. We find a defensible spot and dig in until daybreak. Then we get the hell out of here and call for reinforcements." It was a bitter pill to swallow, the idea of retreat, of leaving these woods without Sarah, or the Kyashi's pelt as a trophy. But I had to be realistic. We were a man down, our weapons seemed all but useless, and we were in completely over our heads. Every instinct I had, honed over a decade of hunting horrors, was screaming at me to get my team out while we still could. But even as I laid out the plan, I could feel the forest pressing in around us, a malevolent weight that seemed to pulse with a savage alien intelligence. The Kyashi was out there watching us, toying with us. And it wasn't going to let us go that easily. It started as a whisper among the trees, a susurrus of rustling leaves that didn't match the still air. Then came the snapping of twigs, the crunch of pine needles beneath unseen feet. All around us, just at the edge of perception, but drawing closer with every passing second. We went back to back without a word, weapons up and trained on the encircling shadows. My heart was a jackhammer behind my ribs, my skin electric with the certainty that we were no longer the apex predators here. We were mice caught in the cat's paw, permitted to scurry and squeak until the killing blow fell. And then, as if a switch had been flipped, the noises ceased. The forest went preternaturally still, not even a bird's wing flutter to break the silence. For a long stretched moment, we held our collective breath, fingers white-knuckled on triggers, every sense straining for a hint of what was coming. The attack, when it came, was a blitzkrieg of tooth and claw from an impossible angle. It burst from the canopy above us, a hurtling mass of fur and fury that slammed into Hank with the force of a wrecking ball. He went down, screaming, his rifle firing wildly as he grappled with a huffing, snarling bulk that seemed to dwarf his massive frame. Chris and I reacted on pure instinct, our weapons roaring in the close confines of our skirmish line. But even as bullets pinged off rock and tore through leaves, I knew it was hopeless. The thing was too fast, too cunning. It used Hank's body as a shield, dragging him into the underbrush, even as he bucked and flailed. And then, in a shambling heartbeat, they were gone, swallowed by the forest as completely as if the earth had opened up and devoured them. Only the echoes of Hank's choked pleas, abruptly silenced, marked their passage. Chris and I stood there, chests heaving, surrounded by smoking brass and a miasma of cordite. His eyes were wide and wild when they met mine, the unspoken question hanging between us. What now? I had no answers, no plan. All my experience, all my hard-won knowledge of how to hunt monsters seemed suddenly and utterly useless. We weren't just in over our heads. We were drowning in an abyssal darkness we had no hope of navigating. The Kai-Aishi had claimed two of us with barely a fight. It was playing a game older than human civilization, and we fumbling intruders had been arrogant enough to think we could best it. Now, we were going to pay the price for that arrogance one by one, until the forest ran red and the monster was sated. Unless I could turn the tables, use its own tactics against it, but that would mean descending into a savagery I'd long held at bay. Embracing a darkness I'd spent my whole life running from. It would mean becoming a monster to fight a monster. I looked at Chris, at the naked fear and desperate hope in his eyes, and I knew I had no choice. For him, for Sarah and Hank, for all the lives the Kaiaishi had stolen over the centuries, I would do what needed to be done. I would walk into the abyss and pray I could find my way back out again. "We need to move," I said, my voice leaden with a finality that seemed to come from somewhere else. "It's not done with us yet, but this time, we're going to be the ones setting the ambush." We ran. What else could we do? The compass of my morality had been smashed, its needle spinning uselessly as I led Chris ever deeper into the forest, into the very heart of darkness. I told myself it was tactical necessity, that we needed to put as much distance between ourselves and the last attack site as possible. But even as those words formed in my mind, I could feel the exultation of the Kaiaishi as it ran alongside us on silent paws. It was herding us exactly where it wanted us to go. I knew that now, with a resigned dread that tasted like old ashes on my tongue. Every step was in lockstep with its design, every ragged breath a victory chorus in its ancient ears. The thought settled in my gut like a ball of lead, cold and nauseating. We couldn't run forever. My lungs burned and my muscles screamed in protest as we crashed through the underbrush, heedless of the branches that whipped at our faces and snagged at our clothes. Chris was flagging beside me, his breathing a harsh, hitching counterpoint to the drum of our footfalls. I risked a glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see the Kaiaishi stalking us in plain sight, savoring our futile flight. But there was only the forbidding wall of trees, their trunks blurring into a single impenetrable mass as the shadows lengthened. We couldn't keep this up. Sooner or later, We would have to make a stand, even if every rational fiber of my being railed against the idea. The Kayaishi had already proven itself the apex predator in this emerald hellscape. What chance did we have, armed only with our wits and a few scraps of metal and magic? But then, as we burst into a small clearing, a flicker of inspiration pierced the fog of exhaustion and dread. The clearing was a near-perfect circle, the ground carpeted with a dense layer of fallen leaves and twigs. At its center stood a towering fir, its trunk gnarled and twisted with age. It was as if the forest had provided the stage for our final confrontation, and in that moment, I knew what we had to do. "Chris," I panted, skidding to a halt. "The tree, we need to get up it." He looked at me like I'd lost my mind, and maybe I had. But there was a method to my madness. If we could gain the high ground, force the Kayaishi to come to us. I didn't wait for his agreement. I was already moving, scrabbling at the rough bark, using knots and low-hanging branches to haul myself up. After a moment's hesitation, I heard Chris follow, his breath rasping in his throat. We climbed like men possessed, fear and adrenaline lending strength to our trembling limbs. The fir seemed to reach forever into the gathering dusk, its upper branches lost in a green haze. But finally, mercifully, we reached a sturdy perch, a natural platform formed by the intersection of three massive boughs. From our vantage point, the clearing looked small and insignificant, a pitiful stage for the drama about to unfold. But it was the best chance we had. Up here, the Kayaishi would have to come to us. It would have to reveal itself, if only for a moment. And in that moment, we would strike. It was a desperate gamble, a last roll of the dice against an implacable foe. But it was all we had left. I motioned for Chris to take up position on the opposite side of the trunk, our rifles trained on the clearing below. And then, with a last shared glance that said more than words ever could, we settled in to wait. The forest seemed to hold its breath around us, the only sound the mournful sigh of the wind through the branches. Minutes crawled by, each one an eternity unto itself. Every creak of wood, every rustle of leaves set my nerves jangling like ill-tuned piano wire. And then, as the last of the light bled from the sky, it came, not in a rush of snarling fury, but in a silent glide that seemed to part the very fabric of the world. One moment the clearing was empty, the next it was there, a hulking shape that dwarfed the firs and seemed to drink in the darkness. Even from our perch I could feel the weight of its presence, the sheer, suffocating malevolence that rolled off it in waves. It was like staring into the abyss and feeling it stare back, cruel and cunning and infinitely patient. For a long, airless moment, it simply stood there, its massive head swinging from side to side as if scenting the air. And then, with a deliberate slowness that spoke of centuries of hunting, it looked up, directly at us. In that instant, I knew we had made a grave miscalculation. We hadn't forced a confrontation on our terms. We had delivered ourselves to the monster's doorstep, gift-wrapped our terror for its delight. Its eyes, glowing like banked coals in the depths of its shaggy head, seemed to mock us. They promised slow, delicious suffering, an end as savage and pitiless as the forest that birthed the beast. Chris fired first, a panicked burst that went wide, rattling the branches around us. I joined him a heartbeat later, my own shots as wild and desperate. It was like spitting into a hurricane, like trying to halt an avalanche with your bare hands. The Kayaishi shrugged off the hits, its hide absorbing the bullets like they were no more than bothersome gnats. And then it gathered itself, muscles bunching beneath its matted fur, and leaped. It hit the tree like a wrecking ball, the impact nearly shaking Chris and me from our perches. Bark exploded around us, splinters flying like shrapnel as the trunk groaned and shuddered. The monster snarled, its jaws snapping shut inches from Chris's dangling foot. He yelped and scrambled higher, his eyes wide and rolling in his chalk-white face. I clung to my branch, my rifle locked in a white-knuckled grip, and stared down into the face of my own mortality. The Kayaishi glared back, its gaze a promise of slow, agonizing dissolution. And in that moment, hanging above the abyss with only heartbeats left to me, I felt something give way inside. Not a breaking, but an opening, like a key turning in a long rusted lock. The part of me that had always held back, that had flinched from the darkness in my own soul, crumbled like rotted wood. What rose in its place was something colder and harder, something forged in the same pitiless depths that had birthed the Kayaishi. A resolve as implacable as the forest itself, as merciless as the oncoming night. I looked into the monster's eyes and saw my own reflection staring back, grim and feral and utterly without fear. And I knew, with a certainty that went beyond mere flesh and bone, that only one of us would walk away from this clearing. The Kayaishi sensed the change, the shift in the air between us. Its snarl deepened, rumbling through the tree like the growl of a coming earthquake. It gathered itself for another lunge, muscles coiling beneath its shaggy hide. But this time, I was ready. This time I didn't flinch or quail. I stared into the heart of the beast and let the darkness in me rise up to meet it. And when it leaped, jaws gaping wide, I leaped to meet it, a wordless howl tearing itself from my throat. We met in midair, hunter and hunted, monster and man. And then we were falling, grappling, snarling, a tangle of fang and fury plummeting towards the unforgiving earth. The world spun dizzily, branches and sky and looming shadows whirling together in a mad kaleidoscope. We hit the ground hard, the impact driving the breath from my lungs in a single agonized rush. For a moment I lay there stunned, my vision swimming with black spots. And then the Kayaishi was on me, its bulk pinning me to the forest floor like a moth on a collector's pin. Its jaws snapped shut inches from my face, its breath a hot, fetid rush that smelled of old blood and rotting meat. I scrabbled at it frantically, my fingers sinking into its shaggy fur, searching for purchase, for some kind of weakness. But it was like grappling with a mountain, like trying to shift the very bedrock of the earth. Above me, Chris was shouting something, his voice high and thin with panic. But his words were lost in the thunder of my own heartbeat, in the snarling breaths of the beast that was about to end me. The Kayaishi lunged again, its teeth aiming for my throat. And in that moment, my groping fingers found what they were searching for, the hilt of my knife, still sheathed at my belt. I ripped it free, the blade glinting dully in the fading light, and then with a final defiant roar, I drove it up and in, burying it to the hilt in the monster's chest. The Kayaishi convulsed, a shudder that started at the point of impact and rippled through its entire frame. For a moment it loomed above me still, its eyes wide and disbelieving. And then it collapsed, its dead weight driving the air from my lungs once more. I lay there gasping, pinned beneath the bulk of my vanquished foe, my hand still locked around the knife hilt. I could feel the warm rush of its blood over my fingers, could hear the fading thunder of its heartbeat. And as the last of the light fled the sky and shadow rushed in to claim the clearing, I began to laugh, a wild, jagged sound that held no mirth, only a grim awareness of how close I'd come to oblivion. It was over. The hunt, the nightmare, the long, slow dance with an ancient evil, all of it was done. But even as that realization settled over me like a shroud, I knew that something else was just beginning. Because I had stared into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back. And in that dark communion, I had glimpsed the true nature of the forest, of the world that lurked beneath the veneer of civilization. I had become a thing of blood and shadow, a creature as pitiless and implacable as the Kayaishi itself. And even as Chris's shouts of concern finally penetrated the fog of my exhaustion, even as I began the long, painful process of digging myself out from under the monster's carcass, I knew that I would never be the same. The forest had marked me, claimed me as one of its own, and no matter how far I ran, no matter how deep I buried myself in the trappings of the human world, I would always feel its call, the dark whisper of the wild in my blood. I had gone into the forest a man. I had emerged a monster. And that, I knew, was a fate I would carry with me all my days, a burden and a dark blessing that would haunt me until the day I drew my last breath. But for now, in this moment, with the taste of victory still sharp on my tongue, and the weight of my dead foe still pressing down on me, I could only close my eyes and let the shadows take me. a final surrender to the darkness that had always been waiting, patient and hungry, in the depths of my soul. The extraction team found us just after dawn, a phalanx of grim-faced men and women in forest camo who descended on the clearing like avenging angels. They had to pry my fingers from the knife hilt, had to physically lift me out from under the Kayaishi's bulk. I let them do it, too drained to resist, too numb to feel anything but a distant, aching relief. Chris hovered at the edges of my vision, his face a mask of concern, and barely suppressed questions. But I had no answers for him, no words to explain the dark epiphany that had overtaken me in the heart of the forest. They airlifted the Kayaishi's carcass out first, a task that required a heavy-duty cargo net and a helicopter with oversized rotors. I watched them do it, watched that hulking shape vanish into the morning mist, and felt a pang of something that might have been regret. It had been a worthy foe in the end, a monster out of primordial nightmare, a dark reflection of everything I had both feared and longed for in the depths of my own soul. To see it reduced to so much lifeless meat, trussed up and carted off like a prize buck, it seemed almost obscene. They put me on the second chopper out, along with Chris. I didn't protest, didn't insist on staying to help with the cleanup. I had done my job, fulfilled my purpose. The rest was just details, the grim logistics of tidying up after a battle that had been waged on a level far beyond the merely physical. As we lifted off, the wash from the rotors sending the trees below into a frenzied dance, I looked down at my hands. They were still stained with the Kayaishi's blood, the knuckles raw and bruised from the struggle. I realized with a dim sense of surprise that they didn't feel like my hands anymore. They felt like someone else's, like the hands of a stranger who had done dark and desperate things. The flight back to base passed in a blur, the chatter of the extraction team fading into a meaningless buzz. Chris tried to talk to me once or twice, his voice low and urgent over the roar of the engines. But I just shook my head, my gaze fixed on some far horizon only I could see. What could I say to him? That I had seen the true face of the world, and it had looked back at me with pitiless, hungry eyes. That I had become something more and less than human, a creature of blood and shadow and primal instinct. He wouldn't understand, couldn't understand, not unless he'd been there, in the heart of the nightmare, grappling with a horror that wore the forest like a second skin. They debriefed us separately, Chris and I, a precaution that seemed both necessary and futile. What had happened out there, in the green hell of the Tillamook, wasn't something that could be captured in words, in tidy reports and clinical analyses. It was a story written in blood and terror, in the dark poetry of tooth and claw and desperate, gasping breaths. I told them what I could, the bare bones of the hunt, the stark details of the Kayaishi's demise. But I left out the heart of it, the moment when I had stared into the eyes of the beast and seen myself reflected back, savage and snarling and utterly, terribly free. That was my secret, my burden and my dark gift. The thing I would carry with me all my days, the shadow that would haunt my steps no matter how far I ran or how deep I buried myself in the trappings of civilization. They gave me a commendation in the end, a medal and a handshake and a speech about valor in the face of impossible odds. I stood there and accepted it, the medal cold and heavy against my chest, and felt like a fraud, like an imposter in my own skin. Because the truth was I hadn't been valiant. I hadn't been brave or noble, or any of the things they spoke of in solemn, ringing tones. I had been scared, terrified. And in that terror, I had touched something dark and primal and utterly ruthless. Something that had always been there, waiting, lurking just beneath the surface of my carefully constructed persona. The Kayaishi had torn away that mask, ripped through the veil of humanity I had worn like a shield. And what had emerged? It wasn't a hero. It wasn't a savior or a champion of the light. It was something older, something fiercer and more feral, a predator, born of blood and shadow and the pitiless law of fang and claw. That was my real commendation, the true medal I would wear for the rest of my days. The knowledge that, deep down, in the secret savage heart of me, I was a monster. And the worst part, the part that woke me in the night, sweating and gasping and reaching for a knife that was no longer there. Was that some small, dark part of me reveled in it, embraced it, wore it like a badge of honor? Because out there, in the green hell of the Tillamook, I had been alive in a way I had never been before. Alive in tooth and claw and desperate snarling breath. Alive in the way of the primordial, the way of fang and fury and blood on the leaves, and that dark, fierce joy. It sang in my veins like a siren song, a call back to the forest, back to the nightmare that had remade me in its own savage image. It was a call I knew I would heed one day, a call I would answer, with a howl and a snarl and a heart that beat in time with the ancient, pitiless rhythms of the wild. But for now, I would go on. I would wear my human mask, walk my human paths. I would pretend for a little while longer to be one of them, the civilized, the tamed, the safe. And all the while, in the depths of my soul, the forest would wait, patient, hungry, calling me home. After quite the rough patch, I ended up in a rickety cabin out in the Ozarks in the winter of 2021. That's what happens when you lose your job, can't keep up with mortgage payments, and your house goes into foreclosure. It was honestly devastating. My wife had passed away 2 years earlier, and every day since felt like swimming upstream. Eventually, I just ran out of steam. After the bank took my home, I called in a favor from an old friend who owned a cabin in Arkansas near the edge of the woods. He said I could rent it for next to nothing, at least until I got back on my feet. I assumed it would be better than sleeping in my truck, so I packed up what little I had left and made the move. The drive down was suffocating in its loneliness. 6 hours of highways that gradually narrowed into state roads, then county roads, and finally a winding gravel path that seemed to disappear into the forest itself. My GPS lost signal about 3 miles before my destination, forcing me to navigate by the crude, hand-drawn map my friend had faxed to me weeks earlier. When I finally arrived, the cabin hardly looked like salvation. It was small, with weathered gray wood that had seen at least 30 winters. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the front porch listed noticeably to the right, as if it were slowly sinking into the earth. A stone chimney climbed up one side, black with decades of smoke. The inside wasn't much better. A main room with a kitchenette, a small bedroom, and a bathroom barely large enough to turn around in. The plumbing worked, thankfully, though the water ran brown for nearly a minute before clearing. The electricity was spotty at best, with lights that flickered whenever the ancient refrigerator kicked on. But it was mine, for now. And as I unpacked my meager belongings, clothes, a few books, some framed photos of better times, I tried to convince myself that this was just temporary, that somehow, at 43 years old, I could rebuild what I'd lost. That first night, I sat on the creaking porch with a cup of instant coffee, watching darkness swallow the woods. The trees stood like sentinels, their bare winter branches clawing at the darkening sky. In the distance, an owl called, the sound echoing through the valley. I shivered, though not entirely from the cold. The first week passed in a blur of small repairs and adjustments. I fixed the leaking kitchen sink, replaced a broken window pane, and cleared years of leaves from the gutters. Physical labor helped quiet my mind, kept me from dwelling too much on what I'd lost. My daily routine took shape quickly. I'd wake at dawn, make coffee on the old gas stove, then drive to the small town 30 minutes away to use the library's internet. The librarian, a gentlewoman in her 60s, took pity on me and would save the daily newspaper. "Not many folks coming through looking for work these days," she said one morning, sliding the classified section toward me. "Most young people move away, nothing much to hold them here." I nodded, not bothering to explain that I wasn't young, and that I hadn't exactly chosen this place. I was just desperate. Each afternoon I'd return to the cabin and work on whatever needed fixing. The isolation was both blessing and curse. No one to judge me for my failures, but no one to talk to either. The silence sometimes pressed in until I could feel it in my chest, heavy and insistent. Nights were the hardest. I'd lie awake listening to the countless sounds of the forest. Wind through branches, animals moving in the underbrush, the occasional distant howl that might have been a coyote, or might have been something else entirely. Sometimes I'd wake in the dark, heart pounding, certain I'd heard something just outside my window. The locals I encountered during my trips to town were friendly enough but reserved, the kind of people who'd nod a greeting but wouldn't pry. At the general store, where I bought canned goods and other necessities, the owner would sometimes share bits of local knowledge. "Supposed to snow tonight," he'd say, bagging my items. "Roads get bad quick out your way. Might want to stock up." Or, "Saw some big animal tracks down by Miller's Creek yesterday. Probably just a bear, but best keep your garbage locked up tight." I appreciated his advice, but noticed how he'd watch me carefully whenever the conversation veered toward the area where my cabin was located. There was something in his expression I couldn't quite read, not quite concern, not quite warning, but something adjacent to both. It was during my third week that things began to change. The weather had turned milder, and new growth was appearing in the forest. I'd grown more comfortable with my surroundings, less jumpy at every snapping twig or rustling leaf. Then, one night, as I dozed in the threadbare armchair by the fireplace, I was jolted awake by a sound outside. Not the usual forest noises I'd grown accustomed to, but something deliberate, a slow, heavy movement along the side of the cabin. I froze, listening intently. There it was again, a shuffling sound, followed by what I could only describe as snuffling, like something with a short snout was sampling the air near my wall. My mind immediately went to bears, which I knew were common in the Ozarks. But something about the sound wasn't right. I'd encountered black bears before on camping trips years ago. They moved differently, breathed differently. This was sharper somehow, with occasional grunts that had an almost porcine quality. I sat motionless until the sounds eventually faded. Even then, I couldn't bring myself to investigate. Something primitive in my brain warned against it. The next morning, I examined the area around the cabin. The ground was soft from recent rain, and there, clear as day, were tracks. Large ones pressed deep into the mud, indicating considerable weight. But they weren't bear tracks, at least none I'd ever seen. The shape was wrong, with toes that seemed too long, too articulated, and the pattern of movement suggested something that walked partly upright. I took photos with my phone, intending to ask someone in town about them, but something held me back. Perhaps it was the fear of appearing foolish, the city guy spooked by ordinary wildlife. Or perhaps it was something deeper, an instinctive reluctance to acknowledge what I'd found. Instead, I spent the day securing the cabin, checking locks, reinforcing the flimsy back door with a chair wedged under the handle. Basic precautions, I told myself. Nothing to do with those strange prints or the unease that had settled in my stomach like a cold stone. That night, the sounds returned. Closer this time, more purposeful. I heard scratching at the kitchen window, a slow, deliberate drag of something hard against the glass. When I finally gathered the courage to look, pressing my face against the cold pane and squinting into the darkness, I caught a glimpse of movement, a large, hunched shape disappearing into the tree line. Over the next few weeks, the visits became more frequent. I would hear movement outside almost every night, sometimes just passing by, other times lingering near windows or doors. I began keeping a journal, noting times and behaviors, trying to find patterns that might explain what was experiencing. One entry read, April 12th, 2:15 a.m. Heavy footsteps on porch. Stayed for approx 10 minutes. Sound of sniffing under door. Left when I accidentally knocked over lamp. Another. April 16th, dusk. Spotted large form at forest edge. Too large for coyote. Wrong shape for bear. Moved in strange loping gait. Watched cabin for nearly an hour before retreating. The evidence mounted. Tufts of coarse grayish hair caught on the rough wood of the porch railing. Deep claw marks on a tree near the cabin, about 6 feet off the ground. And once, a half-eaten carcass of what might have been a raccoon, left prominently in the center of the clearing, almost like an offering or a warning. Sleep became elusive. I would jolt awake at the slightest sound, lying rigid under my blankets, straining to interpret the noises outside. Was that just the wind, or something pressing against the wall? Was that distant cry an owl, or something else entirely? My trips to town became less frequent, partly because I'd had no luck with job hunting, partly because I'd grown increasingly reluctant to leave the cabin unattended for long periods. I couldn't shake the feeling that my absence was noted, perhaps even anticipated. The general store owner commented on my haggard appearance one afternoon as I stocked up on supplies. "You looking a bit rough there," he said, eyeing the dark circles under my eyes. "Everything all right out at that cabin?" I hesitated, then asked, "Do you know if there are any unusual animals in these woods? Anything different from what you'd normally expect?" He paused in his counting of change, his expression cautious. "Different how?" "I don't know. I've been hearing things at night, seeing tracks that don't look quite right for the wildlife I know about." He studied me for a long moment before responding. "These woods are old, older than any of us. Sometimes they hold things that don't have proper names." He pushed my change across the counter. "My advice? Don't go looking for what's looking for you." His words followed me all the way back to the cabin, settling in my mind like a splinter that couldn't be removed. By early May, whatever was visiting my cabin had grown bolder. No longer content to merely circle and investigate, it began testing boundaries. I would wake to find the screen door partially torn from its hinges, or gouges in the wooden windowsills, as if something had tried to pry them open. One morning I discovered all my carefully hung laundry had been pulled from the line and scattered across the yard. Each item had been handled, some torn slightly, others apparently smelled or tasted, small wet spots and saliva marks evident on the fabric. The incident that truly terrified me came after a particularly heavy rainfall. I'd been in town all day and returned to find muddy prints leading directly to my front door. But what froze my blood were the handprints, yes, handprints, pressed into the mud beside the steps. They were large and misshapen, with fingers too long and joints that bent at odd angles, but unmistakably hand-like. That night I barricaded myself inside, pushing the small couch against the door and keeping my baseball bat within reach. Outside, the familiar shuffling began earlier than usual, while the sun was still setting. I could hear it circling the cabin, pausing occasionally, then moving on. Around midnight, the first direct challenge came. A heavy thump against the door, forceful enough to shift the couch slightly. Then another, not quite a ram, but a deliberate test of strength. I stood in the center of the room, bat raised, my breathing shallow and quick. "Go away," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The response was immediate, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls, followed by a higher-pitched sound that resembled nothing so much as laughter. Not human laughter, but the mocking approximation of it, as if something was attempting to mimic a sound it had heard but didn't fully understand. The testing of the door stopped, but I could hear movement around the cabin all night. Slow, patient circling, waiting. In the morning light, I examined the door. The wood had splintered slightly where the creature had struck it. I touched the damaged area, feeling sick. The door wouldn't withstand another such assault. That day, I drove to the nearest hardware store and bought additional locks, a reinforcing metal plate for the door, and heavy-duty flashlights. I couldn't afford a gun, but I picked up bear spray, though I wasn't convinced it would be effective against whatever was stalking me. As I worked to secure the cabin, a terrible thought occurred to me. What if it wasn't trying to get in? What if it was trying to make sure I couldn't get out? The nightly visits continued, growing increasingly aggressive. The creature, I had stopped trying to classify it as any known animal, would scratch at windows for hours, an endless nerve-wracking sound that made sleep impossible. It would knock over anything I left outside, destroy any small repairs I made to the porch or steps. I began to feel that it was studying me, learning my routines, testing my responses. When I shouted or made noise, it would retreat temporarily, only to return more determined than before. When I stayed silent, it would grow bolder, pressing against the walls, as if searching for weakness. One particularly awful night, it discovered that it could reach the bathroom window, which was smaller but less secure than the others. I lay in bed, listening to the methodical scraping as it worked at the frame, trying to create an opening. When the glass finally shattered, I leapt up and rushed to slam the bathroom door shut, wedging a chair under the handle. I stood in the hallway, heart hammering, as I heard something large squeeze through the window, glass tinkling as it was dislodged. Heavy breathing filled the small bathroom, then a snuffling, seeking sound as it scented the air. The doorknob turned slowly, testing the barrier between us. The door shuddered as weight pressed against it, the chair legs squeaking against the floor. I backed away, gripping the bat so tightly my knuckles were white. After what seemed like hours, the pressure eased. I heard more glass breaking as the creature exited the way it had come. But it had crossed a threshold, literally and figuratively. It had breached my sanctuary, if only partially. The message was clear. Nowhere was truly safe. The next day, I boarded up the bathroom window with trembling hands. I called my friend who owned the cabin, trying to keep my voice steady as I asked if there had ever been problems with aggressive wildlife in the area. "Not that I know of," he said, "though I don't get out there much these days. Why? Something bothering you?" I couldn't bring myself to describe what was happening. It sounded too fantastical, too close to madness. "Just curious," I said. "Thought I heard something big around the cabin at night." "Probably just a bear," he replied casually. "They get pretty bold sometimes if they smell food." But it wasn't a bear. I knew that with absolute certainty, and it wasn't after food, at least not the kind you keep in a pantry. That evening, I sat at the small kitchen table writing a lengthy entry in my journal, documenting everything that had happened. If something happened to me, I wanted there to be a record, something to explain what had occurred. As darkness fell, I found myself writing, "I don't think I can stay here much longer. Whatever is out there is getting more aggressive, more determined. Each night it tries something new. Each night it gets a little closer. I don't know what it wants from me, but I can feel its hunger growing. Not just physical hunger, but something deeper, a need to possess, to consume in some way I don't fully understand." I paused, pen hovering over the page as I heard the now familiar sounds beginning outside. Tonight they started with an almost gentle scratching at the chimney, as if it were thinking, considering, planning its approach. By late May, I had reached my breaking point. Sleep deprivation and constant fear had worn me down to a shell of myself. I'd lost weight, my hands shook constantly, and I jumped at the slightest sound. The creature's visits had become a nightly certainty, each one more prolonged and intense than the last. I had decided to leave, to abandon the cabin and whatever strange territory dispute or hunting ritual I had unwittingly become part of. I'd packed my few belongings and planned to depart at first light, when I hoped the creature would be least active. My last evening in the cabin was unseasonably warm. The air felt heavy, charged with an approaching storm. I sat on the porch, nursing a cup of coffee, trying to savor one final moment of peace before my escape. The setting sun cast long shadows through the trees, and the woods smelled of wet earth and new growth. That's when my sixth sense alerted me, that primitive part of the brain that knows when you're being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I slowly turned my head toward the tree line to my left. There it was, partially obscured by a large oak, but visible enough to freeze my blood. Large and hunched, covered in patchy gray fur that revealed sickly, pale skin beneath. Its face was elongated with a short, pig-like snout and eyes that reflected the dying sunlight like dull coins. It stood on two legs, but seemed uncomfortable with the posture. its long arms hanging almost to the ground. Our eyes met across the clearing. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then it opened its mouth, revealing yellow teeth too numerous and too sharp to belong to any normal omnivore, and released a sound that began as a grunt and rose to a high-pitched screech. I dropped my coffee mug, which shattered on the porch boards. My paralysis broke, and I bolted toward the cabin door. But even as I moved, I knew I'd made a critical mistake. I should have remained still, should have backed slowly into the cabin. The sudden movement triggered something primal in the creature, and it surged forward with shocking speed. I sprinted off the porch, veering away from the cabin door, hoping to circle around and approach from another angle. My boots slipped in the mud as I heard crashing behind me, branches breaking, undergrowth being trampled by something heavy and fast. The creature's breathing was loud, wet, and ragged, unnervingly close. I weaved between pine trees, changing direction erratically, using the trunks as barriers. Once I nearly slammed face first into a tree, barely managing to pivot at the last second. I could feel hot breath on my neck, hear snapping jaws just inches from my back. Panic gave me speed I didn't know I possessed. When I spotted the yellow glow of the porch light through the trees, I made a desperate final push. Somehow, miraculously, I reached the porch. I hurled myself at the door, wrenching it open and tumbling inside. My shoulder collided painfully with the door frame, but adrenaline dulled the sensation. I kicked the door shut with my foot and threw the bolt just as something heavy slammed against the other side. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. Outside, the creature howled, a deep, mournful sound that shifted into that horrible pig-like squeal. The porch boards creaked under its weight as it paced back and forth. For several minutes it scratched and pawed at the door, testing the reinforcements I'd installed. I remained frozen on the floor, afraid that even the smallest movement might provoke it further. Then, abruptly, the sound stopped. The silence was almost more terrifying than the attack had been. I strained to hear anything, breathing, movement, any indication of where it had gone. But there was nothing. I spent that night huddled in the center of the room, baseball bat in hand, jumping at every creak and settling sound the old cabin made. But the creature didn't return. Dawn found me still awake, still clutching the bat. As sunlight filtered through the curtains, I gathered my courage and peered outside. The clearing was empty, peaceful in the morning light. Birds sang in the trees as if nothing had happened. I waited until mid-morning before venturing out, moving cautiously, ready to retreat at the first sign of danger. But the woods seemed normal, almost indifferent to the terror of the previous night. Evidence remained, though. Deep prints in the mud showing the creature's pursuit, claw marks on trees where it had used them to change direction during the chase. Near the porch, I found clumps of that coarse gray fur caught on a nail, and what looked disturbingly like saliva dried on the door, thick and yellowish, with an acrid smell that made my stomach turn. I didn't linger. I threw my bags into the truck and left, gravel spitting from beneath my tires as I accelerated down the narrow road. I didn't stop until I reached the town, where I pulled into the general store parking lot and sat with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The owner was sweeping the front step when I approached. He took one look at my face and nodded slightly, as if confirming something to himself. "You're leaving then," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied. "I can't stay in that cabin anymore." He leaned on his broom, studying me. "It found you, did it? The thing in the woods?" My mouth went dry. "You know about it?" He sighed heavily. "Stories go back generations around here. Most folks don't see it. Some feel it watching. A few." He gestured toward me. "A few get its full attention?" "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Don't rightly know," he admitted. "Some say it's just a deformed bear or wild hog. Others claim it's something older, something that was here before people. All I know is it seems to fixate on certain folks, and once it does, it doesn't stop until they're gone." Or dead? I couldn't help asking. He looked away. There have been disappearances over the years. Hunters, hikers, people who stayed too long. I thanked him, though for what exactly I wasn't sure. As I turned to leave, he called after me. It won't follow you if that's what you're worried about. It stays in its territory, always has. His words provided small comfort as I drove away from the Ozarks, constantly checking my rearview mirror until the hills disappeared from view. That was 3 years ago. Life has been kinder since then. I found steady work in a city hundreds of miles away, moved into a small apartment in a densely populated neighborhood where the only nighttime sounds are traffic and occasional sirens. Sometimes I still wake in a cold sweat, certain I've heard snuffling outside my window or scratching at my door. The nightmares come less frequently now, but they haven't stopped entirely. In them, I'm always running through endless woods, something just behind me, its breath hot on my neck. I researched extensively after I left, looking for any scientific explanation for what I encountered. The closest match was reports of feral hogs, which can grow to enormous sizes and have been known to walk short distances on their hind legs. But this explanation feels hollow, inadequate to describe what stalked me in those woods. I never went back to collect the journal I left behind. Sometimes I wonder if someone else has found it, if they've read my increasingly desperate entries and dismissed them as the ramblings of an isolated, grieving man. Or worse, if they've recognized the truth in them because they've experienced something similar. There are things in this world we don't fully understand, creatures that exist in the margins between what we know and what we fear. I can't explain what happened to me in the Ozarks, can't neatly categorize or classify the thing that hunted me for those terrible weeks. All I know is that there are places where humans are not the apex predator, where we are little more than intruders, tolerated until we're not. And when toleration ends, all we can do is run and hope that we're faster than whatever is chasing us. In 1972, a plane carrying 45 passengers crashed in the midst of the towering, snow-covered Andes Mountains. A group of passengers miraculously survived, but now faced the most challenging task: surviving in the harsh conditions of this unforgiving place. The cold was biting and conditions were severe. There was no sign of life in this place, far from all elements of civilization. Food sources were non-existent, and the little food that was on board the plane quickly ran out. Here the survivors faced the most difficult decision of their lives, having to eat the bodies of their deceased companions in order to stay alive. The circumstances these passengers went through were harder than anything imaginable, yet they continued to fight and cling to survival. Would they eventually survive, or would this be their final journey? Our story begins in October 1972. The protagonists are a rugby team from Uruguay. Rugby is a sport somewhat similar to American football. Most of the team members were university students in their early 20s. Uruguay, for those unfamiliar, is one of the countries in South America. The team had been invited to play a match in Chile, also a South American country. The trip was supposed to be short, just 4 days. They planned to leave on Thursday and return on Monday. The team chartered an affordable plane, given that they were young and didn't have much money. It was a medium-sized aircraft that could seat about 50 people, with the number 571. After the team sent a passenger list to the pilot, he informed them there was room for 10 additional people. So some team members decided to bring family along. In the end, the total number of passengers reached 45, including the flight crew. Among the passengers was a young man named Nando Parado, one of the team members. It's important to remember this person as he will play a major role in the story. We can even consider him the main character. When Nando learned there were extra seats on the plane, he decided to bring his mother and sister along. He imagined taking them on an enjoyable trip, touring Chile and visiting markets. It was like a gift he was giving them with all his love. He had no idea that what awaited them would be worse than anything he could imagine. Their journey began on Thursday, October 12, 1972. They departed from Montevideo, Uruguay, heading to Santiago, Chile. They had to fly over Argentina and the Andes mountain range, towering mountains stretching long distances, considered the highest in South America. But due to bad weather that day, the pilot decided to land in Mendoza, Argentina, located just before the Andes. They spent that night in Argentina and resumed their journey on the morning of Friday, October 13th. In Western culture, Friday the 13th is considered an unlucky day. The pilot and team members weren't thinking about this at the time, but what would happen that day would indeed be the worst thing they could imagine. The plane they were on was a Fairchild FH-227, considered one of the worst in terms of design. Its engines were weak relative to its weight, making it prone to accidents. The passengers were unaware of this information. If they had known, they likely wouldn't have chosen to fly on it. During the flight, the plane had to cross over the Andes Mountains. This posed a significant risk, especially with the bad weather and weak engines. The pilot planned to circle around the southern end of the Andes range and cross through a low pass, avoiding flying at high altitudes. The mood on the plane was cheerful and lively. Passengers were playing games and singing, unaware of the danger ahead. In a pivotal moment, Nando traded seats with a friend, a decision that would later determine who would survive and who would perish. The plane reached the southern end of the Andes, and the pilot turned west towards the city of Curico. But here, a fatal error occurred. The pilot reported to air traffic control in Santiago that they were over Curico, when in fact they were still over the Andes Mountains. This mistake in determining their position would lead to disaster. The pilot thought they had passed the mountains and began descending, but visibility was poor due to clouds and storms surrounding the Andes peaks. Suddenly, the pilot and passengers found themselves face to face with a towering mountain. The pilot desperately tried to pull the plane up, but the weak engines couldn't provide enough power to climb at the required speed. The plane struck the mountain, and in an instant, the tail and wings were torn off. Most of the fuselage disappeared, leaving only the front section. In that horrifying moment, several passengers were ejected with the disintegrating parts, especially those seated in the rear of the plane. The front section continued sliding down the snowy slope, with the remaining passengers inside clinging to life. The following moments were chaotic and terrifying, with seats flying loose and passengers' bodies colliding. Despite the catastrophic crash, there was an element of luck. The pilot's final attempt to pass through a curve in the mountain saved the front of the plane, and its relatively smooth slide down the snow saved many lives. In the end, out of the 45 passengers, 33 survived the initial impact, but many were seriously injured. In the first hours after the crash, the survivors tried to comprehend the tragic situation they found themselves in. They were at an altitude of about 3,600 meters above sea level, in an environment none of them were accustomed to. Snow and storms surrounded them on all sides, and the biting cold penetrated to their bones. The less injured survivors tried to help those more severely hurt. The scene was tragic: scattered bodies, unconscious individuals, others suffering from fractures and serious injuries. Nando, who was still unconscious, was placed near the plane's exit, exposed to the severe cold. Here, something strange and amazing happened. Nando had suffered internal bleeding in his brain, and according to medical experts, his exposure to extremely low temperatures may have helped save his life. The intense cold helped limit brain swelling and reduce bleeding. This was like an unintended miracle. After 3 days, Nando began regaining consciousness. He was in a state of confusion, trying to understand what had happened. His friends, not considering his fragile health condition, bombarded him with the bad news all at once: the plane crash, his mother's death, and his sister's severe injuries. Despite the shock, Nando quickly grasped the situation. He asked about his sister and tried to comfort her when he learned of her location. He felt immense guilt for bringing her on this ill-fated journey. His sister was only 17 years old. After regaining his balance, Nando left the plane wreckage to see the surroundings. He was shocked by what he saw. Nothing but mountain peaks and endless snow in every direction. There was no sign of life. Not even animals existed in this harsh environment. The survivors hoped rescue teams would reach them soon. Indeed, 3 countries were participating in the search operations: Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile. But the problem was that the search area was vast, and weather conditions were extremely difficult. Additionally, the plane was white and had crashed on white snow, making it nearly impossible to spot from the air. The survivors heard the sounds of search planes flying overhead, and even glimpsed some from afar. But despite their attempts to attract attention, no one could see them. They held their breath and stood on edge, waiting for any news of their rescue. As days passed without being found, some began to lose hope. The idea that they had survived the initial crash seemed impossible, let alone surviving for several days in these harsh conditions. But the survivors themselves didn't lose hope and remained convinced they would be rescued. However, their situation was worsening day by day. Nando tried to stay by his sister's side and comfort her, but her injuries were too severe. On the 5th or 6th day, his sister passed away, reducing the number of survivors to 27. As more days passed, the survivors gradually lost hope, reaching the peak of despair on the 10th day. An important development occurred. The survivors had a small radio, and thanks to one person's expertise in electronics, they managed to create a makeshift antenna. This allowed them to pick up some radio stations and follow news about the search for them. But what they heard was shocking. Authorities announced that search operations had been halted and they couldn't be found. This news shattered the last glimmer of hope for the survivors. At the same time, hunger had begun to gnaw at their bodies severely. They had consumed all the food from the plane days ago. For water, they managed to solve this problem by using metal sheets from the plane to melt snow under the sun. But the food problem was more complex. They tried to eat anything edible, including leather from luggage and plastic. But these desperate attempts were not enough. And here the idea they all feared began to emerge: eating the bodies of their deceased companions. The idea was horrifying and terrifying for everyone. Most of them completely rejected the idea at first, while some reluctantly accepted it. It was clear there was no other way to survive: either starve to death or eat the dead. There was no third option. Some refused the idea for religious reasons, while others couldn't accept the idea of eating human flesh, especially that of their friends. It was impossible for a normal person living in normal conditions to imagine themselves in this situation. But these survivors were on the brink of death, and their ability to endure and way of thinking had completely changed. In the end, they made the difficult decision. Due to the freezing cold, the bodies were well preserved, not decomposing. They needed tools to cut the meat, so they used pieces of glass from the plane's windows to make makeshift knives. They would take small pieces each time, not making large meals. Sometimes they would cook the meat, but due to the scarcity of wood and combustible materials, they rarely managed to light a fire. Most of the time, they ate the meat raw. They all ate while disgusted with themselves. But when this meat entered their bodies and began to break down into proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, they felt energy returning to their bodies, even if only slightly. In these moments, their minds realized this was the only way to survive, no matter how disgusted they were by it. To cope better with this situation, they made an agreement among themselves. Anyone who died would allow the others to eat their body. They took photos of themselves with a camera found in the plane wreckage, and in some of these photos, parts of their companions' bodies can be seen. As days passed, they began to get used to this situation. It became part of their daily life in this place, their only source of food. They continued like this, clinging to any hope of survival, with no specific goal other than staying alive. But the difficulties didn't stop there. There was another danger awaiting them, one they were unaware of. The Andes Mountains, due to their towering height and the massive amounts of snow that fall on them, were prone to frequent avalanches. The tragedy was that the place where the plane wreckage had settled was like a valley surrounded by mountains on all sides, making it vulnerable to any avalanche that might come from above. Around the 15th day, the weather began to worsen, and large amounts of snow started falling on the area where they were. The survivors remained sheltered inside the plane's fuselage, and even built a wall-like structure using luggage and belongings to cover the opening of the fuselage. Heavy snowfall continued for about 3 days, and as the snow accumulated, the likelihood of avalanches increased. On the night of the 18th day, while the survivors were inside the plane's fuselage, they suddenly heard a sound like an explosion, as if it were a massive thunderclap. Immediately after, they felt a vibration in the ground, as if 1,000 horses were galloping towards them. In an instant, an avalanche hit the plane's fuselage, burying everyone under massive amounts of snow. The situation turned to chaos in a moment. Some were completely buried under the snow, to the point where they could no longer move at all. This is one of the worst ways a person can die. Being buried alive under snow in this deadly cold, unable to move or even breathe. Others were partially buried but could move a little. Those who could move began trying to dig themselves out. Some suffered serious injuries due to the force of the avalanche that violently struck them and threw them inside the plane's fuselage. Those who could move began trying to help the buried and injured and get them out. The situation was extremely difficult. The biggest problem was that even those who managed to get out from under the snow found no safe shelter around them. The world around them was all snow, and there was no place to take refuge or feel warmth. The entire plane fuselage was buried under the snow. The survivors remained trapped inside the fuselage for 3 days. They were all buried under the snow, but inside the fuselage. The fuselage was the only thing protecting them. Outside, snowstorms were raging, and they could hear the sound above their heads from under the snow. Strangely, the avalanche turned from a curse into a blessing, as it formed a barrier protecting them from the massive storms outside. They remained sheltered inside the plane's fuselage, and their only source of warmth was 1 or 2 small lighters. But the situation remained tragic. The avalanche caused the death of 8 of them, reducing the number of survivors from 27 to just 19 people. However, the death of these 8 was in itself a kind of tragic blessing. It provided the rest with an additional food source to live on, while at the same time reducing the consumption of the limited food sources they had. It's terrifying to talk about death in this way, but this was the reality they were living in. After 3 days under the snow, they finally managed to get out. The plane's fuselage was almost buried under the snow, but they slowly began removing the snow with their hands and cleaning the inside of the fuselage. The fuselage was like a home or shelter for them, the only place they could take refuge. As days continued to pass, the survivors began thinking of ways to get out of this predicament. Some might wonder why they didn't try to explore or move from their location. In fact, they did try. They were particularly looking for the plane's tail, believing it might contain supplies or things that could help them. But these attempts always ended in failure. They couldn't move far from the plane's fuselage. The main reason was the depth of the snow. When they walked on the snow, their legs would sink into it, making walking extremely difficult. Additionally, the weather conditions were highly unpredictable. Suddenly, fierce snowstorms could hit, and without proper clothes or equipment to protect them, advancing in any direction was extremely difficult and dangerous. Even their eyes were affected. They had nothing to protect their eyes from the intense glare of the snow, making visibility difficult. All their initial attempts to explore the surrounding areas were unsuccessful. They would cover short distances, and then returned to the fuselage. The survivors realized they needed a solution to the problem of walking on snow. And in situations like this, when survival is the primary goal, humans begin to invent tools to help them. As they say, necessity is the mother of invention. After deep thinking, they came up with the idea of using the foam from the plane seats along with belts to create something like snowshoes. These innovative shoes proved effective in walking on snow. They reached this invention after about a month from the beginning of their ordeal. During this month, many of them began to see Nando as the leader. He was the one among them with the strongest desire to survive, and he was always trying to motivate them and push them to continue. Incidentally, Nando was the oldest among them, so those younger than him began to see him as a leader, and he took on this role seriously and began to act as the group's leader. One day, after trying the snowshoes and feeling they would enable them to move longer distances, Nando and two of his companions, Roberto and Antonio, decided to start a new exploratory journey. They chose a day when the weather was relatively clear and the sun was shining, and they began to move. Their plan was to try to move away from the plane for as long as possible and return on the same day. It was like an experiment. They kept walking as they descended into the valley, and after climbing a hill, they saw the plane's tail from afar. The tail had flown to this location after the plane crash. They immediately headed towards the tail to explore it from the inside. They found some bags inside and began searching for any food they could find. But all they found was a small chocolate bar. At least it was a good change from the food they had become accustomed to. Among the things they also found was a camera. This camera is the one they used to take the photos that documented their survival journey in these mountains. They also found 20 4-volt batteries that were installed in the plane's tail. Here, an idea occurred to them. They remembered that at the beginning they had tried to use the plane's radio to communicate with any possible entity. They thought that maybe the battery in the radio was faulty, and that they might be able to use these new batteries to operate the plane's radio again. Nando and his companions covered a greater distance than they had planned, and they felt that time was running late. So they decided to return to their friends who were waiting for them at the plane's head the next morning. After returning with the battery, the survivors began trying to connect it to the plane's radio. There was a person named Roy Harley who had some experience with radio devices. He wasn't a specialist, but due to his basic knowledge of these matters, they appointed him as their radio expert. But the matter was very complicated, especially since they had no real knowledge of these things. There were hundreds of wires and connections everywhere. How could they connect these wires to the battery and make the radio work? It was almost impossible without real technical knowledge. Unfortunately, despite their great efforts and numerous attempts with the radio, they failed to make it work. This failure crushed their morale and made them feel more desperate. Nando, although he was also disappointed, tried to instill some hope in his companions. He would tell them, "As long as we are alive, we must not despair and must continue trying to find a way to survive." Nando was also the one who came up with the idea of using the camera to document their survival journey with photos. He would tell them, "Even if we don't survive, maybe after a few years or even 100 years, someone might find the plane wreckage and these photos, and they'll know that we stayed alive and tried." Almost 2 months had passed since the day of the crash. Among the 19 remaining people, several were injured. Some had been injured since the moment of the initial crash, and their pain was increasing with each passing day. Survival was becoming harder and harder for them. During this month, 3 more of them died, reducing the number of survivors from 19 to 16 people. Out of the 45 who were on the plane, only 16 remained. Most of the bodies of the dead had been eaten by the living, and only a few bodies remained. Among these remaining bodies were those of Nando's mother and sister. Nando being still alive, no one wanted to touch the bodies of his mother and sister. He decided to leave them until the last moment. Nando would always tell his close friend Roberto that they needed to get out of this place. How long would they remain standing in the same spot? All directions around them were frightening, as if they were in the middle of a vast ocean with no knowledge of its beginning or end. The plane's fuselage was like a small boat protecting them from this ocean, so the idea of leaving this boat was scary. This is what prevented them from moving from their place. They were afraid that any attempt to move away from this place would mean certain death. But after more than 2 months without any new sign of hope, the only option became to move from their place. Of course, everyone was afraid of this. It was like throwing oneself into the ocean literally, as they didn't know their exact location. The only idea they had was that they were currently on the western side of the Andes Mountains. They remembered that before the co-pilot died, he had told them they had passed the city of Curico, which is on the western side in Chile, so they believed they were in this area. But in reality, they were closer to the eastern side. They had been thinking all along that if they moved from this spot, they should head west because it was closer to civilization and cities, although in reality, the east was closer. On the western side, there was a high mountain in front of them, while in the east there was a valley. Going down to the valley would have been easier than climbing the mountain, but they thought that if they headed east, they would face higher and more difficult mountains, because they thought the east was far from them, while the west was close. This is what they believed, because they didn't know their real location. In reality, if they had headed east, they would have found a hotel about 20 kilometers from their location, and there were no high or towering mountains between them and the hotel. The only thing that could have hindered them was a river, and this river would indeed have been difficult to cross. But if they had reached the river near the hotel, they would most likely have been able to call for help from people on the other bank. Heading east was probably the best option for them. The path was still difficult and long, but if they had known all this information, this would undoubtedly have been their best choice. But because they believed they were on the western side, they were always convinced that if they moved from this spot, they should head west because this was their best option. Nando was insistent on getting out of this place at any cost, but the rest of the group were procrastinating due to their fear and hesitation. Whenever Nando tried to convince them, their response was that the time wasn't right, or the weather wasn't suitable, or that they needed to wait a little longer. It was clear that fear had taken hold of them. Nando realized he couldn't leave alone, so he kept trying to convince them, or at least convince some of them, to go with him. Most of them encouraged the idea of embarking on this journey, but they weren't ready to go with him. Each of them would say, "Yes, I agree with you. Someone needs to go out and try to bring help, but I can't, brother." They supported the idea, but no one volunteered to take the risk with him. Even his close friend Roberto was hesitant at first. This was his closest friend and the one who had gone with him when they found the plane's tail. But after Nando's insistence, Roberto finally agreed. The third person Nando convinced to go with them was Antonio. He was also the third person who had been with them when they found the plane's tail, and he was the most physically fit among them, so he was the natural choice for this journey. So, the same three who had gone out and found the plane's tail were now going to set out on a journey in search of new hope. This journey would be a journey of no return. Either they would reach safety or die trying. Therefore, they had to make all their preparations. And the rest of the group, despite their fear and hesitation, helped in preparing for the journey and provided all possible support. First, they allocated a larger share of food to the three, a share that could last them for several days, even though food was already scarce. Second, they needed a way to protect themselves from the cold at night, as it was impossible to survive amidst these mountains without something to protect them. Here, one member of the group, named Carlos, collected heat-insulating materials from inside the plane's fuselage and sewed them together using electrical wires to create something like a sleeping bag. The sleeping bag was large enough for the three of them and was very durable. Several of them took turns sewing it, and the sewing process itself took a few days. After preparing all the necessary items and tools, the trio, Nando, Roberto, and Antonio, bid farewell to their friends and set out on their difficult journey on December 12, 1972. The last thing Nando said to his friends who remained at the plane was that if they ran out of food and needed to use the bodies of his mother and sister, he gave them permission to do so. After that, the three headed west, and directly in front of them was a large mountain. They believed this mountain was the biggest obstacle in front of them, and they thought that once they reached its summit, they would be able to see the green valleys and cities or villages on the Chilean side. They realized that climbing this mountain alone would require at least a full day. They began climbing the mountain, and it was an extremely tiring and exhausting process. Climbing on this steep slope was very difficult, especially since they had no previous experience or practice in mountain climbing. At these altitudes, even breathing was difficult due to the lack of oxygen in the air. The more they moved and exerted effort, the more oxygen they needed. But due to the lack of oxygen, breathing became harder and harder. With every step they took, they faced the risk of slipping. They tried to hold on to themselves but couldn't. With every step they climbed, they would slide half a step. They then tried to climb the rocky parts, which required tremendous strength and high fitness. Rocks would sometimes fall on them. Perhaps the only thing that helped them was that they had lost a large amount of their weight. Each of them had lost about 30 or 40 kilograms. Finally, after all the effort they had exerted, they reached what they thought was the summit. But the peak in front of them was what is called a false summit. This is a peak that appears from below to be the mountain summit. But when you reach it, you discover it's a false summit, and that there's a higher peak in front of you, and that you have to climb more to reach it. This crushed their morale when they reached this false summit. But at least this place was suitable for spending the night. They slept huddled together and used the sleeping bag their friends had made for them. The cold was very harsh, but at least the sleeping bag enabled them to survive. The next day, the three continued their arduous climbing journey. Their friends who had remained at the plane's fuselage could still see them climbing. They saw them as small dots from afar, but they were still within their field of vision. After the three climbed further up the mountain, Roberto noticed something from afar that looked like a street or road, but it was on the eastern side, the opposite side to them. He pointed it out to his friends and asked if that looked like a road. Nando said he couldn't see any road, and Antonio said he wasn't sure. But Roberto insisted that it was a road, and even began arguing with Nando, saying it would be better to go down the mountain and head towards this road on the eastern side. But Nando firmly rejected this suggestion and told them, "We've climbed all this distance, so why should we go back down?" In fact, what Roberto saw was indeed a road used by people, but it was on the eastern side. They could have reached it if they had headed east, but now it had become far from them. Until this moment, they had believed they were closer to the western side. So they made the decision to continue their journey westward and continue climbing the mountain. The climb was extremely exhausting and took much longer than they had expected. They thought they would need 1 day to reach the summit, but it took them 3 days. The hope that drove them to continue climbing to the summit was that they would see the green valleys and villages or cities on the western side. This had always been their hope, that when they reached the summit, they would see these things. But the big shock came when they actually reached the summit. What they saw was snow-covered mountains extending as far as the eye could see. There were no fields, no green valleys, no cities, no villages, no signs of life at all. The amount of despair they felt at that moment is indescribable. After all this effort and all this hardship, the result was nothing. Nando, despite feeling all the emotions of despair at that moment, turned to his friend Roberto and said, "Let's continue, and whatever happens, happens. Either we reach safety or we die trying. Roberto, although he was at the peak of despair at that moment, when he saw Nando speaking this way, felt energy returning to him again and said, "By God, you're right, my friend. We've come this far, so let's continue, and whatever happens, happens. Either we live together or we die together." But being three was slowing down their movements, and in addition, their provisions and food had decreased significantly. So Nando turned to their third friend, Antonio, and said to him, "Antonio, you go back and give us what's left of your provisions and food, and return to the plane. Roberto and I will continue alone." Antonio agreed to this, gave them what was left of his provisions, and went back down the mountain. Of course, going down was 1,000 times easier and faster. It probably only took a few hours. When Antonio came down from the mountain, his friends who were at the plane saw him and went to him. He told them that they had seen nothing but mountains extending as far as the eye could see, and told them that Nando and Roberto had taken the rest of the provisions he had and decided to continue the journey on their own, and that nothing would stop them except death. Nando and Roberto continued walking westward. They came down from the mountain they were on top of, but from the other side. Under the mountain, there was a single path extending between the mountains, so they decided to follow this path. The mountains surrounding them were towering, but luckily, this time, they didn't have to climb any of these mountains. They were trying to follow the paths and valleys between these mountains. Of course, they sometimes had to climb some hills or small peaks, but they didn't have to climb a high mountain like the first one. Due to the size of the mountains surrounding them and the vastness of the place they were in, it was difficult for them to sense distance. They had no sense of the distance they had covered or would cover. And perhaps this was a blessing in itself, because if they had known how to calculate the distance, they might have felt despair. But all that occupied their thoughts at that time was just moving forward, and this certainly helped them psychologically. This arduous journey of theirs between the mountains continued for 10 days from the time they left their friends at the plane. But finally, after these 10 days, they reached the line that was for them the lifeline, the line where the snow ended and life began. This moment was like a new life for them. The joy and happiness they felt cannot be described. They began walking in the green valleys they had been dreaming of 10 days ago. Finally, they felt they had really returned to life. And even on their way, they saw a cow. So they began to tell themselves that there must be people somewhere near them. They were still in the midst of wilderness and nature, and hadn't seen people yet, but they felt they were getting close. They began to see trees, grass, flowers, and even water. Nando and Roberto say that in those moments, they felt as if they had entered a 5-star hotel. The weather was beautiful, there was water, and they even had grass to eat. They felt that these simple things, which we see in our daily lives in an ordinary way, were the greatest thing in the world. During these 10 days, Nando and Roberto had covered more than 60 kilometers to reach the place they were now. But even after reaching these green valleys, they spent one more night in the open. The next morning, they continued their journey and reached a river. And here was the surprise. There was a man riding a horse on the opposite bank. They began shouting at him and gesturing to him. Communication between them was difficult because the river separating them was quite large, and the sound of the rushing water was loud, so they couldn't hear each other. Of course, the man on the horse was surprised in turn at how these people had reached the top of these mountains, because they were still considered to be in the mountains, even though they had descended quite a distance. Of course, Nando and Roberto had no option to cross the river by swimming, because the river's current would have swept them away due to its strength. So the man on the other bank had an idea. He took a piece of paper and a pen, tied them to a stone, and threw them to the other bank towards Nando and Roberto. Nando took the paper and pen and immediately began writing a message explaining their situation. This is a real image of the letter Nando wrote. He wrote, "We come from a plane that fell in the mountains. We are from Uruguay. We have been walking for 10 days, and at the plane's fuselage, there are still 14 injured people waiting for rescue. We have no food or provisions and need help as soon as possible. Please help us. We can't even walk anymore." Nando threw the letter to the man on the other bank, and signs of shock were clear on the man's face as he read what was written in it. After reading it carefully 2 or 3 times, he signaled to Nando that he understood the situation and indicated to them to stay where they were and that he would bring them help. Before he left, the man took a piece of bread and cheese and threw them towards Nando and Roberto. This bread and cheese were the first food other than human flesh they had tasted in the past 2 months. The man on the horse took many hours before he could bring help, because the place where they were was still far from civilization and cities. The man's journey alone took about 10 hours. But finally, this man returned with a number of soldiers and military personnel who were able to rescue Nando and Roberto. These shots you see before you are real footage of the moment of their rescue and when they were found for the first time. Their condition was miserable, of course, and the signs of fatigue and suffering they had endured were evident on them. These shots and images were taken by journalists as soon as the news reached them. The journalists came with the military, as if they had suddenly appeared out of nowhere on top of the mountains. In this picture, we see Roberto on the right and Nando on the left, and in the middle, the man who was on the horse and who can be considered their savior, whose name was Sergio Catalan. Imagine that the journalists didn't even give them time to breathe. They immediately began conducting interviews with them. One of the journalists even asked them, "How did you survive all this time? What were you eating?" Roberto was about to answer, but Nando intervened and told the journalist that they wouldn't answer this question. The journalists, frankly, were not behaving appropriately at all. These 2 men had just come out of hell, literally. They should have been left to rest a little, and they should have moved to rescue the rest of the survivors at the plane. The soldiers and security authorities tried to find out the location of their friends from Nando and Roberto. They brought them a map to try to determine their location. Nando was familiar with the location because he had remained focused on the directions they had walked, as he knew he had to remember the location so they could return to rescue the others later. Nando pointed to them the location where he thought the plane was. They told him that this location was on the Argentine side, on the eastern side of the mountains, and that it was impossible for them to have walked all this distance. Nando told them, "By God, I don't know if we're in Argentina or not, but I'm almost certain that this is the location of the plane." Of course, the distance that Nando and Roberto had walked was about 60 kilometers. The authorities and police were unable to comprehend how 2 people in such a weak and emaciated state could have covered all this distance, so they were skeptical about the location. But Nando kept insisting that this was the location. Their friends who had remained at the plane had been waiting anxiously for the past 10 days. Some had even lost hope and thought that Nando and Roberto had died on the way, but at the same time, they were following the news on the radio. You can't imagine their joy when they heard on the radio the news that Nando and Roberto, 2 survivors from Flight 571, had been found. Their happiness was indescribable. They knew that finally they would be rescued. I ask you by God to imagine their feelings at that moment. I'm sure it was the most beautiful feeling they had experienced in their entire lives. It was as if they were born again. They began hugging each other, and all the joy in the world couldn't contain their happiness. The authorities and police called for helicopters to begin the rescue operation. Once again, the helicopter pilots asked Nando about the location, and he pointed to the same spot on the map. But the pilot said to him, "Look, it will be difficult for me to find them on my own. I need you to come with me." And although Nando was certainly tired at that moment, he said to him, "Okay, I'll come." So Nando boarded one of the helicopters and began flying with them as they tried to trace the path he had come from. The weather was good that day, but despite this, Flying at these high altitudes was difficult for the helicopters. The aircraft was shaking frighteningly. Thank God that they didn't have an accident and fall among the mountains again. Imagine the tragedy if that had happened. But finally, the helicopters passed over the high mountain that was in front of them. This was the same first mountain that Nando and Roberto had climbed. Nando kept pointing downwards and saying that the plane's fuselage was below them. But the fuselage was white, and everything around was white with snow, so it was almost impossible to see. Even when the aircraft got close to the location, they couldn't see the fuselage. And here we understand why the previous search attempts for them had failed. Although there were planes flying in the areas above them, seeing them was almost impossible. Even Nando and the helicopter pilots couldn't see the plane's fuselage and the rest of the survivors until they descended to a very close altitude to them. If Nando hadn't known the place and the terrain and this specific spot, it would have been impossible to find them. The helicopters landed at the site of the plane wreckage, and finally they saw the rest of the group below waving to them, flying with joy. This is a real image taken from a camera on board the helicopter at the moment they finally found them. And here we also see real video footage of the plane wreckage. All of Nando's 14 friends who were left at the wreckage were rescued. I'm sure none of them will forget that day, which was December 22nd, 1972, the day of rescue. And glory be to God for the number of days they spent from the day of the plane crash until they were rescued, is the same as the number of the year they were in, 72 days from the moment of the crash. The remaining 14 survivors, along with Nando, were brought to safety. Their condition was, of course, very poor. Each of them had lost between 30 to 40 kilograms of their weight, but joy was evident on their faces. And after that, their names were announced on the radio so that their families would know who had survived. Of course, shortly after, they met with their families and were reunited again. News of this story spread and was covered by media around the world. It became a global story. But afterwards, many articles appeared in newspapers talking about the subject of their survival by eating the bodies of their friends. This particular aspect spread, and perhaps was one of the reasons that made people attracted to this story. When one hears that they survived by eating their friends, they are shocked. Some of these articles even began to speak against them and call them cannibals. There was a great debate about this issue, and discussions began among people about whether, if we were in their place, would we do the same as they did or not. In the end, if they hadn't eaten their friends, it would have been impossible for them to survive. This story is one of the most famous survival stories that spread around the world. Books were written about it and documentaries were filmed, and it received huge media attention. Nando and his friends appeared in many interviews and forums and told their story in all its details. This was one of the biggest stories that was circulated in the media because of its power and strangeness, and perhaps also because of its somewhat happy ending. The 16 survivors continued to meet over the years. They would hold a gathering every year on the same date they were rescued, December 22nd. And by the way, all the talk we said about Nando, especially that he was the undisputed leader of the journey, all this talk was by the testimony of his friends. It wasn't him who talked about himself and said, "I was the leader, and I saved them, and I did." They all knew that the greatest credit after God in their survival was to Nando and his insistence until the last moment on survival, no matter what the circumstances. Nando, who at the beginning of the crash was considered dead and remained unconscious for 3 days due to the brain injury he suffered, and whose survival from it was something miraculous in itself, still communicates and meets with Roberto and Sergio, the horsemen who found them after they came down from the Andes Mountains. Their relationship with him remains strong, and they are still friends to this day. At the end of the story, it's impossible for one of us to comprehend the conditions these people lived through amidst these mountains. We won't know their feelings and their psychological, mental, and physical state they were in, unless we were actually in their place. And finally, I conclude with a question for you. If you were in their place, do you think you would have been able to do what they did? Would you have been able to eat the flesh of your friends? And here we have reached the end of the story. Whoever hasn't subscribed to the channel, please subscribe and click on the bell button. And there are also other amazing stories you can listen to.